Hey guys, tonight we begin a journey into one of history's most shocking secrets. A time when being clean was considered dangerous, when doctors prescribed dirt over soap, and when the wealthy literally died from their own filth. I'm talking about the Victorian era, an age so obsessed with moral purity that they completely ignored physical cleanliness. What you're about to hear will make you grateful for every hot shower you've ever taken. Picture this. It's 1850 London, and you're walking down a street where the smell is so overwhelming that people are fainting. The River Thames is basically an open sewer. Children are black with soot from head to toe, and the wealthy are wearing the same underwear for months at a time. This isn't some dystopian nightmare. This was real life for millions of people. And the most mind-blowing part, they thought this was perfectly normal. Tonight, we're diving deep into the Victorian hygiene crisis that was so catastrophic, it literally killed more people than wars. You'll discover why brilliant doctors were thrown into asylums for suggesting people wash their hands, how makeup actually dissolved women's faces, and why Victorian hospitals had a death rate that would make modern horror movies look tame. But here's what's really wild. Many of these hygiene disasters happened to the richest, most refined people of their time. Before we step into this fascinating and frankly terrifying world together, I'd love it if you could hit that subscribe button and give this video a like, but only if tonight's story truly captivates you. And I'm genuinely curious, where are you listening from right now? Are you tucked in bed, maybe with a cup of tea, grateful for your clean sheets and fresh pajamas? Drop a comment and let me know, because after tonight's story, you might never take modern cleanliness for granted again. Now, dim those lights, get comfortable, and let's travel back to a time when being dirty wasn't just normal. It was practically a way of life. So here's something that'll blow your mind right off the bat. In 1840s London, the average person took a bath maybe once or twice a year. And we're not talking about poor people living in slums. We're talking about wealthy aristocrats, educated doctors, and even members of parliament. Queen Victoria herself was considered quite progressive because she took a bath once a month. Once a month? Can you imagine? But here's where it gets really wild. This wasn't because they were lazy or didn't have access to water. Oh no, they actively believed that bathing was dangerous. Victorian medical textbooks, written by the smartest doctors of their time, warned that too much water on the skin could cause everything from pneumonia to mental illness. They genuinely thought that dirt acted as a protective layer against disease. One popular medical journal from 1861 literally stated that the layer of dirt on the skin serves as a natural barrier against harmful vapors. Now, let me paint you a picture of what daily life actually looked like back then. Imagine waking up in a grand Victorian mansion. You're wealthy, educated, and considered the height of sophistication. You put on the same linen undergarments you've been wearing for 3 weeks straight, because washing them too often would make them weak and liable to tear. Your corset hasn't been cleaned in months, and it's starting to develop its own ecosystem, but you powder your face with lead-based makeup and consider yourself perfectly presentable. The irony is almost laughable if it wasn't so tragic. These were people who could recite poetry, discuss philosophy, and build magnificent buildings, yet they were walking around carrying diseases that could kill them. They had indoor plumbing in many cases, but they were afraid to use it for anything more than drinking water. And speaking of water, let's talk about what they were drinking. The Thames River, which supplied water to most of London, was essentially a flowing toilet every day. Thousands of tons of human waste, dead animals, and industrial chemicals poured directly into the same river people were drinking from. But Victorian engineers weren't worried about the sewage. They were concerned about the river's miasmas or bad air. They literally thought disease came from smelling bad things, not from contaminated water. Here's a story that perfectly captures the absurdity of it all. In 1854, there was a cholera outbreak in London that killed over 600 people in just a few weeks. A brilliant doctor named John Snow figured out that the disease was spreading through contaminated water from a specific pump on Broad Street. He presented his evidence to the medical establishment, complete with maps and statistics. Their response: they ignored him completely and continued to blame the outbreak on bad air from the Thames. It would take another 30 years before they finally accepted that maybe, just maybe, dirty water could make you sick. But here's what's really fascinating about the Victorian mindset. They weren't stupid people. They were incredibly innovative in so many ways. They built railways, invented photography, and created some of the most beautiful architecture in history. Yet when it came to basic cleanliness, they had this massive blind spot that literally killed millions of people. The wealthy had their own special brand of hygiene horror. Take the typical Victorian lady's morning routine. She'd wake up, splash a tiny bit of cold water on her face, maybe, and then spend an hour getting dressed in layers upon layers of unwashed clothing. Her dress might weigh 15 pounds when dry, but with all the accumulated sweat, oils, and general filth, it could weigh twice that. And perfume? Oh, they doused themselves in perfume, not because they wanted to smell nice, but because they needed to cover up the stench of their own bodies. The men weren't any better. Victorian gentlemen would wear the same shirt for a week, the same suit for months, and the same hat indefinitely. They had these elaborate rituals around their facial hair, spending hours grooming their moustaches and beards, but they'd do it all without ever actually washing their faces with soap. It was like polishing a dirty car, lots of effort on the surface, but the foundation was still filthy. And children, oh, the poor children. Victorian parents believed that keeping kids too clean would make them weak and susceptible to disease, so they deliberately let their children play in dirt, roll around in filth, and go weeks without baths. The mortality rate for children under 5 was astronomical, nearly 30% in some cities, and while they blamed everything from bad air to moral weakness, they never considered that maybe, just maybe, basic cleanliness might help. What's truly heartbreaking is that the solutions were right there. Soap existed. Clean water was available in many places. The Romans had figured out public baths and sanitation systems over 1,000 years earlier, but Victorian society had convinced itself that cleanliness was somehow morally suspicious, medically dangerous, and socially unnecessary. The really tragic part is how this affected the most vulnerable people in society. Workers in factories were covered in toxic chemicals and metal dust all day, then went home to tenements where dozens of families shared a single outdoor toilet. But instead of addressing these horrific conditions, Victorian reformers focused on things like moral education and proper behaviour. They were literally worried about people's souls while their bodies were being destroyed by preventable diseases. But here's what's absolutely mind-blowing. Even as people were dying in droves from cholera, typhoid, and dysentery, the Victorian establishment doubled down on their anti-cleanliness beliefs. They created elaborate theories about why disease spread, and every single one of them avoided the obvious truth that dirt and contamination were the problem. As we close this first chapter of our Victorian hygiene horror story, I want you to think about this. Everything we've talked about tonight, the fear of bathing, the contaminated water, the unwashed clothes, this was considered normal, even sophisticated behavior by some of the smartest people of their time. It makes you wonder what beliefs we hold today that future generations will look back on with the same mixture of horror and disbelief. But we've only scratched the surface of this incredible story. Coming up next, we're going to dive into something even more shocking. How Victorian doctors, the very people who were supposed to heal and protect, became the greatest enemies of cleanliness. You'll hear about medical professionals who literally declared war on water, prescribed dirt as medicine, and convinced an entire generation that soap was dangerous. The stories you're about to hear will make tonight's revelations look tame by comparison. So stay with me as we continue this journey into history's most hygienically challenged era. Now, here's where our story takes a truly sinister turn. Imagine walking into a doctor's office in 1860 suffering from a painful infection and being told that the cure is to stop washing your hands. Not only that, but the doctor prescribes you a daily dose of dirt, actual dirt, to rub into your wounds. You'd think you were being pranked, right? But this was real medical advice from some of the most respected physicians of the Victorian era. The medical establishment of the 1800s didn't just ignore cleanliness. They actively fought against it with the passion of religious crusaders. These weren't quack doctors selling snake oil from the back of wagons. We're talking about graduates from prestigious universities, authors of medical textbooks, and personal physicians to royalty. And they were absolutely convinced that water was one of the most dangerous substances on Earth. Let me tell you about Dr. James Gully, one of the most famous physicians in Victorian England. He ran a medical spa in Malvern that attracted patients from across Europe, including Charles Darwin himself. But here's the kicker. Gully's revolutionary treatment involved avoiding baths at all costs. He believed that immersing the body in water would cause what he called aquatic shock, leading to immediate death or permanent paralysis. Instead, he prescribed what he called dry friction therapy, basically rubbing patients down with coarse towels and dirt. Dr. Gully's medical journal from 1842 contains this gem of wisdom. The human skin, when exposed to water for extended periods, becomes dangerously permeable to disease-causing vapors. A single warm bath can open the pores so wide that deadly miasmas rush directly into the bloodstream. He genuinely believed that people were dying because they were too clean, not because they were filthy. But Gully wasn't alone in his water phobia. The entire Victorian medical establishment had developed what can only be described as hydrophobia on steroids. Medical schools taught that frequent bathing could cause everything from consumption to madness. The Royal College of Physicians published guidelines in 1848 stating that adults should bathe no more than 4 times per year, and children should avoid water entirely except for drinking. Here's where it gets really wild. These doctors had developed elaborate theories to explain why cleanliness was dangerous. They believed in something called skin breathing, the idea that human skin needed to breathe through a layer of natural oils and dirt. Washing this layer away, they claimed, would suffocate the skin and poison the blood. One prominent medical text from 1855 warned that soap removes the body's natural armor against disease, leaving the patient vulnerable to atmospheric poisons. The irony is almost too much to bear. While these doctors were warning against the dangers of soap, they were performing surgeries with unwashed hands, using instruments that hadn't been cleaned in months, and treating patients in hospitals where the mortality rate was higher than on actual battlefields. But they couldn't see the connection between filth and disease because their entire medical philosophy was built on the wrong foundation. Let me share a story that perfectly illustrates the madness of Victorian medicine. In 1847, a Hungarian doctor named Ignaz Semmelweis was working in a maternity ward in Vienna. He noticed something disturbing. Women who gave birth with the help of doctors died at 3 times the rate of women who were attended by midwives. After months of investigation, Semmelweis realized the difference was that doctors were coming straight from performing autopsies to delivering babies, without washing their hands. Semmelweis instituted a simple policy. All medical staff had to wash their hands with chlorinated lime solution before treating patients. The results were immediate and dramatic. The death rate in his ward dropped from 18% to less than 2% almost overnight. You'd think the medical community would have celebrated this breakthrough, right? Wrong. They were absolutely furious. The response from Semmelweis's colleagues was swift and brutal. They accused him of insulting their honor by suggesting that gentlemen's hands could be dirty. The president of the Vienna Medical Society publicly declared that a gentleman's hands are always clean by definition. Other doctors organized a campaign to discredit Semmelweis, calling his hand-washing requirement an affront to medical dignity. But here's the most heartbreaking part of the story. The hospital administration, bowing to pressure from senior physicians, forced Semmelweis to stop his hand-washing policy. Within months, the death rate in his ward shot back up to previous levels. Women were literally dying because doctors were too proud to admit they might have dirty hands. Semmelweis tried desperately to spread his findings to other hospitals across Europe. He wrote detailed reports, presented statistical evidence, and begged his colleagues to try his simple hand-washing protocol. The medical establishment's response was to mock him publicly, ban him from medical conferences, and eventually have him committed to a mental asylum. He died in that asylum in 1865, beaten by guards, still trying to convince people that clean hands could save lives. Meanwhile, across the English Channel, British doctors were developing their own unique brand of medical insanity. Dr. John Elliotson, a professor at University College London, became famous for his earth cure treatments. He would literally prescribe dirt, specific types of soil from different regions, as medicine for various ailments. Patients with stomach problems were told to eat clay from the countryside. Those with skin conditions were instructed to roll naked in freshly ploughed fields. Elliotson's medical rationale was that since humans originally came from the earth, returning to direct contact with soil would restore natural health. He published papers with titles like The Healing Properties of Terra Firma and Why Cleanliness Contradicts Nature's Design. His treatments were so popular that wealthy patients would travel hundreds of miles to roll around in his specially selected dirt. The fear of water went beyond just bathing. Victorian doctors believed that even drinking too much water could be fatal. They recommended that adults consume no more than 2 glasses of water per day, and that all water should be mixed with wine, brandy, or laudanum to neutralize its dangerous properties. Children were given beer or gin instead of water because doctors believed pure water would poison their developing systems. Dr. Thomas Wockley, the founder of the Lancet Medical Journal, wrote in 1851, "Water, in its pure form, is perhaps the most dangerous substance known to medical science. It dissolves the body's essential salts, weakens the blood, and opens pathways for disease that nature intended to keep closed." This wasn't some fringe opinion. This was published in the most respected medical journal of the time. The hospitals themselves were monuments to medical ignorance. Surgeons would wear the same blood-stained coats for months, considering the stains as badges of honor that showed their experience. Operating theaters had floors covered in sawdust to soak up blood, but the sawdust was rarely changed. Surgical instruments were passed from patient to patient without any cleaning whatsoever. One hospital in London kept detailed records that showed just how deadly this approach was. In 1863, they performed 347 amputations, Of those patients, 312 died, a 90% mortality rate, but instead of questioning their methods, the hospital's chief surgeon concluded that amputations were inherently dangerous and recommended performing fewer of them. It never occurred to him that maybe, just maybe, the problem was the filthy conditions. The most tragic part is that these doctors genuinely believed they were helping people. They had convinced themselves that their patients were dying despite their excellent care, not because of it. When Semmelweis and others tried to introduce basic hygiene practices, they saw it as dangerous quackery that threatened everything they had been taught. What's truly mind-boggling is that these same doctors could see the benefits of cleanliness in other contexts. They knew that clean surgical instruments worked better. They understood that fresh food was healthier than rotten food. But when it came to human bodies, they had this massive blind spot that cost countless lives. The medical profession's war on water created a cascade of suffering that extended far beyond hospital walls. When the most educated, respected members of society were telling people that cleanliness was dangerous, it reinforced every dirty habit and unsanitary practice throughout Victorian culture. If doctors said dirt was healthy, then who was going to argue? As we've seen, the Victorian medical establishment didn't just fail to promote hygiene, they actively sabotaged it. But the story gets even more shocking when we look at what people were actually wearing day after day, month after month. Coming up next, we're diving into the absolutely horrifying world of Victorian clothing and personal garments. You'll hear about underwear so filthy it could stand up by itself, dresses that became breeding grounds for deadly bacteria, and fashion choices that literally killed the people wearing them. The clothing horrors we're about to explore will make everything we've discussed so far seem almost quaint by comparison. Picture this scene from 1856. Lady Margaret Worthington, one of London's most fashionable socialites, is getting dressed for an important dinner party. Her maid helps her into a corset that hasn't been washed in 8 months, followed by a chemise that's been worn continuously for 6 weeks. The smell is so overwhelming that the maid has to step back and take a breath. But here's the truly shocking part. Lady Margaret considers herself impeccably dressed and perfectly clean. This wasn't unusual behaviour for a mentally unstable person. This was high society fashion at its finest. Welcome to the absolutely horrifying world of Victorian clothing hygiene, where garments became breeding grounds for disease, and where the phrase "dress to kill" took on a disturbingly literal meaning. What you're about to hear will make you want to hug your washing machine and never take clean clothes for granted again. Let's start with the foundation of Victorian fashion, underwear. And oh my goodness, the stories these garments could tell if fabric could speak. Victorian underwear wasn't just dirty, it was a biological hazard that would make modern hazmat teams run screaming. The average Victorian woman owned perhaps 3 or 4 sets of undergarments, and she would wear each set for weeks, sometimes months, before considering a change. Here's a diary entry from Charlotte Benson, a middle-class Victorian woman dated March 15th, 1862. Changed into fresh linens today for the first time since Christmas. The old set had become quite stiff and could nearly stand upon its own. Mother says this is perfectly normal, and that too frequent changing weakens the fabric and invites disease into the body. Christmas to March, that's nearly 3 months of continuous wear. But it gets worse, much worse. Victorian women believed that washing undergarments too frequently would make them loose, and therefore morally suspect. A properly virtuous woman's underwear should be sturdy enough to maintain its shape without constant washing. The irony is heartbreaking. They were so obsessed with moral cleanliness that they completely ignored physical cleanliness. Men's underwear was equally horrific, but for different reasons. Victorian gentlemen typically owned even fewer undergarments than women, sometimes just 2 sets total. They would wear one set while the other was airing out, which basically meant hanging in a closet for a few days to let some of the smell dissipate. Actual washing happened maybe twice a year, if that. Thomas Carlyle, the famous Victorian writer, kept detailed personal journals that give us a disturbing glimpse into typical male hygiene habits. In 1844, he wrote, "Put on the brown wool undergarments this morning. Have been wearing the white cotton ones since October, and they have served admirably. The brown ones feel strange against the skin after so many months in the white ones." October to April, 6 months in the same underwear. But here's where the clothing horror story really takes off. Victorian garments weren't just dirty, they were actively dangerous. Women's dresses could weigh anywhere from 15 to 37 pounds when dry, but with accumulated sweat, oils, and general filth, they could easily double in weight. Imagine carrying around a 50-pound bacterial ecosystem everywhere you go, and you'll start to understand the Victorian fashion experience. The corsets were perhaps the most terrifying garments of all. These weren't just uncomfortable, they were death traps wrapped in whalebone and fabric. A typical Victorian corset was designed to be worn continuously for months without removal. The padding inside would become compressed and mouldy, creating the perfect environment for dangerous bacteria to thrive. Medical records from London hospitals show that corset-related infections were responsible for hundreds of deaths annually in the 1860s. Dr. Alice Hamilton, one of the few female physicians of the era, wrote in her 1889 medical journal, "I have observed festering wounds beneath corsets that have been worn continuously for 12 weeks or more. The combination of restricted airflow, accumulated moisture, and constant pressure creates conditions comparable to a battlefield hospital, but worse, because the patient must continue wearing the infected garment." Let me tell you about a particularly gruesome case that perfectly illustrates the danger of Victorian clothing practices. In 1867, a wealthy merchant's wife named Elizabeth Hartwell died of what doctors called mysterious blood poisoning. The autopsy revealed massive infections across her torso, all stemming from her corset. When they finally cut the corset away from her body, they discovered that the fabric had literally fused with her skin in several places. She'd been wearing the same corset for 4 months straight. The washing practices for outer garments were somehow even more horrifying than the underwear situation. Victorian dresses were cleaned maybe once or twice a year, if ever. The wealthy would simply buy new clothes when the old ones became too disgusting to wear, while the poor would wear the same dress until it literally fell apart. Here's a fascinating and disturbing economic fact. In 1870 London, there were more clothing shops than laundries. The city had over 3,000 stores selling new clothes, but fewer than 200 commercial laundries. This tells you everything you need to know about Victorian priorities. It was cheaper and more socially acceptable to buy new clothes than to clean the ones you already owned. The fabric choices made everything worse. Victorians loved heavy materials like wool, velvet, and thick cotton that trapped moisture and odors. These fabrics were nearly impossible to clean effectively with the limited washing methods available. A typical Victorian wool dress, after a few months of wear, would develop what people politely called character, but what we would recognize as a complex ecosystem of bacteria, fungi, and parasites. Children's clothing was perhaps the most heartbreaking aspect of this whole nightmare. Victorian parents believed that keeping children's clothes too clean would make them weak and susceptible to disease, so they would deliberately let their children wear filthy, contaminated garments for weeks at a time. The child mortality rate in heavily industrialized areas like Manchester was over 40% in the 1860s. and while Victorian doctors blamed everything from bad air to moral weakness, they never considered that maybe dressing children in bacterial breeding grounds might be part of the problem. The wealthy had their own special brand of clothing horror. Take the case of Lord Pemberton, whose household accounts from 1855 show that he spent more money on perfume in a single month than most people earned in a year. But here's the kicker. He was using all that perfume to cover up the stench of clothes that hadn't been properly cleaned in months. His personal valet's diary mentions that his lordship's favourite evening jacket possessed such a powerful odour that it could clear a room within minutes. The perfume industry absolutely boomed during the Victorian era, and it wasn't because people wanted to smell nice. It was because they desperately needed to cover up how terrible they actually smelled. Perfume shops offered special, heavy-duty scents, designed specifically to mask the odour of unwashed clothing. Some of these perfumes were so strong they could cause headaches and nausea. But Victorians considered this a small price to pay for social acceptability. But perhaps the most shocking aspect of Victorian clothing hygiene was how it affected intimate relationships. Imagine being married to someone whose clothes were literally rotting on their body. Victorian marriage manuals from the 1850s actually include advice on how to politely tolerate your spouse's natural odours and recommend separate bedrooms to preserve marital harmony despite physical discomfort. The textile industry of the time was complicit in this madness. Clothing manufacturers designed garments that were difficult or impossible to wash effectively. Dresses had multiple layers, complex construction, and delicate trimmings that would be destroyed by water. It was as if the entire fashion industry was designed to prevent people from staying clean. Here's a mind-blowing statistic. The average Victorian dress contained over 30 yards of fabric in various layers. To properly clean such a garment would require dismantling it completely, washing each piece separately, and then reconstructing the entire outfit. Most people simply couldn't afford the time or money required for this process, so they just didn't do it. The working class faced even more impossible choices. Factory workers would come home covered in toxic chemicals, metal dust, and industrial grime. But they typically owned only 1 or 2 sets of clothes. They couldn't afford to stop working long enough to properly clean their garments, so they would just add more layers of dirt and contamination day after day, week after week. What's truly tragic is that the technology for better clothing hygiene existed. Commercial laundries were operating in other parts of Europe with great success. Improved soaps and cleaning agents were available. But Victorian society had convinced itself that frequent clothes washing was unnecessary, unhealthy, and morally suspicious. The social pressure to avoid washing clothes was enormous. A woman who changed her dress too frequently was considered vain and possibly immoral. A man who paid too much attention to the cleanliness of his clothing was viewed as effeminate and weak. So people suffered in silence, wearing increasingly filthy garments because social convention demanded it. As horrifying as the clothing situation was, it was actually just one small part of a much larger hygiene catastrophe that was unfolding across Victorian cities. The real epicenter of this disaster wasn't in people's closets. It was flowing right through the heart of London itself. Coming up, we're going to explore the most notorious hygiene crisis in human history, the Great Stink of 1858, when the smell of London became so overwhelming that it nearly shut down the government. You'll hear about rivers that caught fire, streets that were literally toxic to walk on, and a city so polluted that people thought the world was ending. The summer of 1858 will forever be remembered as the year London nearly choked to death on its own filth. What happened during those sweltering months was so catastrophic, so overwhelmingly disgusting, that it earned a name that still sends shivers down historians' spines: the Great Stink. But here's what's truly mind-blowing. This wasn't a natural disaster or an act of war. This was a man-made catastrophe decades in the making, and it almost brought the most powerful empire on Earth to its knees. Picture this. It's July the 2nd, 1858, and you're walking across Westminster Bridge in London. The temperature has been hovering around 84 degrees Fahrenheit for weeks, which might not sound too bad. But remember, this is a city with no air conditioning, no electric fans, and absolutely no proper sewage system. As you reach the middle of the bridge, the smell hits you like a physical force. It's not just unpleasant, it's so intense that you start gagging uncontrollably. Your eyes begin to water, your throat burns, and you genuinely feel like you might pass out. Now, imagine that smell isn't coming from a single source. It's rising from the Thames River itself, the same river that flows through the heart of London, past Parliament, past Buckingham Palace, past the homes of millions of people. The Thames, which had once been described as a silver ribbon threading through England's crown jewel, had become what one journalist called an open sewer of unspeakable horror. The numbers are almost impossible to believe. Every single day, London's 2.5 million residents were producing approximately 250 tons of human waste. And where was all this waste going? Directly into the Thames. No treatment, no processing, no attempt at containment. Just raw sewage flowing straight into the river that supplied drinking water to half the city. But human waste was just the beginning of this nightmare. The Thames was also receiving the untreated discharge from hundreds of factories, slaughterhouses, chemical plants, and tanneries. Dead animals were thrown directly into the river. Horses, cows, pigs, dogs, and countless smaller creatures. Hospital waste, including amputated limbs and surgical refuse, was dumped straight into the water. One horrifying inventory from July 1858 counted over 3,000 animal carcasses floating in just a 2-mile stretch of the river. Here's where the story gets even more shocking. The Victorian government's response to this crisis wasn't to clean up the Thames. It was to soak the curtains in Parliament with lime chloride so that members could continue working without vomiting. Think about that for a moment. The smell was so bad that the people running the British Empire couldn't perform their duties, but instead of fixing the problem, they just tried to mask it. Benjamin Disraeli, who would later become Prime Minister, wrote in his diary during the Great Stink, "The smell from the Thames is so overwhelming that I fear for the continuation of civilized government. Yesterday, 3 members of Parliament fainted during session, and the Speaker of the House was forced to abandon his post twice due to nausea. We are governing the greatest empire in history from behind perfumed handkerchiefs." The Thames had become so toxic that fish were dying in massive numbers and floating to the surface in what witnesses described as carpets of death. The river, which had once supported a thriving fishing industry, became completely lifeless. Watermen, the people who made their living transporting passengers across the Thames, started wearing cloth masks soaked in vinegar and herbs. But even that wasn't enough. Many of them simply abandoned their trade because the smell was unbearable. Queen Victoria herself was forced to cancel a royal pleasure cruise on the Thames because the smell was so overwhelming that she couldn't remain on deck for more than a few minutes. Her personal physician, Dr. James Clark, wrote, "Her Majesty's planned river excursion was curtailed after merely 5 minutes upon the water. The Queen suffered immediate respiratory distress and declared the Thames unsuitable for any living creature, much less royalty." But here's the truly insane part. Many Victorians still believed the river water was safe to drink, despite the visible sewage, the floating corpses, and the overwhelming stench. Water companies were still pumping Thames water directly into London homes. They would strain out the largest chunks of debris and call it purified. One water company's advertisement from July 1858 actually boasted, "Our Thames water is filtered through the finest cloth to remove visible impurities, ensuring the natural healthfulness that only river water can provide." The health consequences were catastrophic beyond imagination. Cholera outbreaks were sweeping through London like wildfire, killing thousands of people. But Victorian medical authorities refused to make the connection between the contaminated water and the disease. They insisted that cholera was caused by miasmas, bad smells in the air, rather than contaminated water, so their solution was to burn aromatic herbs and spray perfume around the city, while people continued drinking sewage and dying by the thousands. Dr. John Snow, whom we met earlier, was frantically trying to convince anyone who would listen that the Thames water was killing people. He had mapped cholera outbreaks and could clearly show that deaths clustered around areas with the worst water contamination. But the medical establishment continued to ignore him. The Royal College of Physicians actually published a statement in August 1858 declaring that Dr. Snow's water theory is not only incorrect but dangerous, as it distracts from the real cause of cholera, which is atmospheric contamination. The social dynamics of the Great Stink reveal just how twisted Victorian priorities had become. The wealthy neighbourhoods of West London were upwind from the worst of the smell, so the rich could largely ignore the crisis. But the poor, who lived downstream and downwind, were literally suffocating in the stench. Working-class families were forced to keep their windows closed even in the sweltering heat, turning their homes into airless ovens. The economic impact was staggering. Tourism to London virtually disappeared during the summer of 1858. International trade slowed as foreign merchants refused to travel to a city that smelled like death. Property values along the Thames plummeted by as much as 60% in some areas. The Port of London, which had been one of the busiest in the world, saw shipping traffic decrease by nearly 40% as ship captains refused to dock in what they called the most foul-smelling harbour in Christendom. Newspaper reports from the time read like descriptions of an apocalypse. The Times of London wrote on July 18th, 1858. Parliament was forced to adjourn early yesterday as the stench from the Thames rendered the chamber uninhabitable. Several honourable members were observed covering their faces with handkerchiefs soaked in cologne. But even this proved insufficient against the overwhelming malodor that seems to emanate from the very bowels of hell. The Daily Telegraph reported, "Citizens are fleeing London in numbers not seen since the Great Fire of 1666. Those who remain venture outdoors only when absolutely necessary, and many are wearing improvised masks fashioned from cloth and herbs. The city feels abandoned, as if pestilence itself has taken residence along our once proud Thames." What's truly heartbreaking is that solutions existed. Paris had already implemented a comprehensive sewage system that successfully managed waste from a similarly large population. The technology was available, the engineering knowledge existed, and there were plenty of examples of cities that had solved these problems. But London's leaders were so committed to the idea that government shouldn't interfere with private business that they refused to act. The sewage crisis had been building for decades. As London's population exploded from 1 million to 2.5 million between 1800 and 1850, the city's medieval waste management systems became completely overwhelmed. But instead of modernising, authorities just allowed more and more waste to flow into the Thames. It was like trying to drain an ocean with a teaspoon, except the ocean kept getting bigger and more toxic. The tipping point came when the smell became so bad that it literally threatened the functioning of government. Parliament couldn't meet, courts couldn't convene, and basic city services ground to a halt. Finally, in desperation, Parliament passed the Great Stink Act of 1858, authorising emergency funds for sewage system construction. But even then, the work proceeded slowly because many politicians still believed the crisis would resolve itself naturally. The human cost of Victorian London's sewage disaster extended far beyond the Great Stink of 1858. Conservative estimates suggest that contaminated Thames water killed over 30,000 people between 1850 and 1860. But the true number was probably much higher, because many deaths from cholera, typhoid, and dysentery were attributed to other causes by doctors who refused to accept the connection between filthy water and disease. Children were the most vulnerable victims. In the poorest neighbourhoods along the Thames, child mortality rates during cholera outbreaks reached 70%. Entire families would be wiped out in a matter of days, not because effective treatment didn't exist, but because authorities refused to acknowledge that clean water might prevent the disease in the first place. What makes this story even more tragic is that the technology to solve London's sewage crisis had existed for decades. The ancient Romans had built sophisticated sewage systems 1,500 years earlier. Contemporary cities like Hamburg and Amsterdam had modern waste management facilities, but London, the capital of the world's most powerful empire, was drowning in its own excrement because of political inaction and medical ignorance. The Great Stink finally forced Victorian society to confront the consequences of their hygiene negligence, but the damage was already done. Millions of people had suffered, tens of thousands had died, and an entire generation had grown up thinking that toxic rivers and deadly air were just normal parts of city life. As catastrophic as the Great Stink was for London as a whole, it was nothing compared to the daily horror that awaited anyone unlucky enough to need medical treatment. The next chapter of our story takes us inside Victorian hospitals and doctors' offices, where the hygiene nightmares we've been discussing reach their absolute peak. You're about to hear about surgical procedures performed with instruments that hadn't been cleaned in months, operating theatres where the floors were thick with blood and bacteria, and medical facilities so dangerous that patients literally had a better chance of survival if they stayed home and treated themselves. The summer of 1858 will forever be remembered as the year London nearly choked to death on its own filth. What happened during those sweltering months was so catastrophic, so overwhelmingly disgusting, that it earned a name that still sends shivers down historians' spines: the Great Stink. But here's what's truly mind-blowing. This wasn't a natural disaster or an act of war. This was a man-made catastrophe decades in the making, and it almost brought the most powerful empire on earth to its knees. Picture this. It's July the 2nd, 1850, and you're walking across Westminster Bridge in London. The temperature has been hovering around 84 degrees Fahrenheit for weeks, which might not sound too bad. But remember, this is a city with no air conditioning, no electric fans, and absolutely no proper sewage system. As you reach the middle of the bridge, the smell hits you like a physical force. It's not just unpleasant, it's so intense that you start gagging uncontrollably. Your eyes begin to water, your throat burns, and you genuinely feel like you might pass out. Now, imagine that smell isn't coming from a single source. It's rising from the Thames River itself, the same river that flows through the heart of London, past Parliament, past Buckingham Palace, past the homes of millions of people. The Thames, which had once been described as a silver ribbon threading through England's crown jewel, had become what one journalist called an open sewer of unspeakable horror. The numbers are almost impossible to believe. Every single day, London's 2.5 million residents were producing approximately 250 tons of human waste. And where was all this waste going? Directly into the Thames. No treatment, No processing, no attempt at containment, just raw sewage flowing straight into the river that supplied drinking water to half the city. But human waste was just the beginning of this nightmare. The Thames was also receiving the untreated discharge from hundreds of factories, slaughterhouses, chemical plants and tanneries. Dead animals were thrown directly into the river. Horses, cows, pigs, dogs, and countless smaller creatures. Hospital waste, including amputated limbs and surgical refuse, was dumped straight into the water. One horrifying inventory from July 1858 counted over 3,000 animal carcasses floating in just a 2-mile stretch of the river. Here's where the story gets even more shocking. The Victorian government's response to this crisis wasn't to clean up the Thames. It was to soak the curtains in Parliament with lime chloride so that members could continue working without vomiting. Think about that for a moment. The smell was so bad that the people running the British Empire couldn't perform their duties, but instead of fixing the problem, they just tried to mask it. Benjamin Disraeli, who would later become Prime Minister, wrote in his diary during the Great Stink, "The smell from the Thames is so overwhelming that I fear for the continuation of civilised government. Yesterday, 3 members of Parliament fainted during session, and the Speaker of the House was forced to abandon his post twice due to nausea. We are governing the greatest empire in history from behind perfumed handkerchiefs." The Thames had become so toxic that fish were dying in massive numbers and floating to the surface in what witnesses described as carpets of death. The river, which had once supported a thriving fishing industry, became completely lifeless. Watermen, the people who made their living transporting passengers across the Thames, started wearing cloth masks soaked in vinegar and herbs. But even that wasn't enough. Many of them simply abandoned their trade because the smell was unbearable. Queen Victoria herself was forced to cancel a royal pleasure cruise on the Thames because the smell was so overwhelming that she couldn't remain on deck for more than a few minutes. Her personal physician, Dr. James Clark, wrote, "Her Majesty's planned river excursion was curtailed after merely 5 minutes upon the water. The Queen suffered immediate respiratory distress and declared the Thames unsuitable for any living creature, much less royalty." But here's the truly insane part. Many Victorians still believed the river water was safe to drink. Despite the visible sewage, the floating corpses, and the overwhelming stench, water companies were still pumping Thames water directly into London homes. They would strain out the largest chunks of debris and call it purified. One water company's advertisement from July 1858 actually boasted, "Our Thames water is filtered through the finest cloth to remove visible impurities, ensuring the natural healthfulness that only river water can provide." The health consequences were catastrophic beyond imagination. Cholera outbreaks were sweeping through London like wildfire, killing thousands of people. But Victorian medical authorities refused to make the connection between the contaminated water and the disease. They insisted that cholera was caused by miasmas, bad smells in the air, rather than contaminated water. So their solution was to burn aromatic herbs and spray perfume around the city. While people continued drinking sewage and dying by the thousands, Dr. John Snow, whom we met earlier, was frantically trying to convince anyone who would listen that the Thames water was killing people. He had mapped cholera outbreaks and could clearly show that deaths clustered around areas with the worst water contamination. But the medical establishment continued to ignore him. The Royal College of Physicians actually published a statement in August 1858 declaring that, "Dr. Snow's water theory is not only incorrect but dangerous, as it distracts from the real cause of cholera, which is atmospheric contamination." The social dynamics of the Great Stink reveal just how twisted Victorian priorities had become. The wealthy neighbourhoods of West London were upwind from the worst of the smell, so the rich could largely ignore the crisis. But the poor, who lived downstream and downwind, were literally suffocating in the stench. Working-class families were forced to keep their windows closed even in the sweltering heat, turning their homes into airless ovens. The economic impact was staggering. Tourism to London virtually disappeared during the summer of 1858. International trade slowed as foreign merchants refused to travel to a city that smelled like death. Property values along the Thames plummeted by as much as 60% in some areas. The Port of London, which had been one of the busiest in the world, saw shipping traffic decrease by nearly 40% as ship captains refused to dock in what they called the most foul-smelling harbour in Christendom. Newspaper reports from the time read like descriptions of an apocalypse. The Times of London wrote on July 18th, 1858, Parliament was forced to adjourn early yesterday as the stench from the Thames rendered the chamber uninhabitable. Several honourable members were observed covering their faces with handkerchiefs soaked in cologne. But even this proved insufficient against the overwhelming malodor that seems to emanate from the very bowels of hell. The Daily Telegraph reported, "Citizens are fleeing London in numbers not seen since the Great Fire of 1666. Those who remain venture outdoors only when absolutely necessary, and many are wearing improvised masks fashioned from cloth and herbs. The city feels abandoned, as if pestilence itself has taken residence along our once proud Thames." What's truly heartbreaking is that solutions existed. Paris had already implemented a comprehensive sewage system that successfully managed waste from a similarly large population. The technology was available, the engineering knowledge existed, and there were plenty of examples of cities that had solved these problems. But London's leaders were so committed to the idea that government shouldn't interfere with private business that they refused to act. The sewage crisis had been building for decades. As London's population exploded from 1 million to 2.5 million between 1800 and 1850, the city's medieval waste management systems became completely overwhelmed. But instead of modernising, authorities just allowed more and more waste to flow into the Thames. It was like trying to drain an ocean with a teaspoon, except the ocean kept getting bigger and more toxic. The tipping point came when the smell became so bad that it literally threatened the functioning of government. Parliament couldn't meet, courts couldn't convene, and basic city services ground to a halt, finally, in desperation. Parliament passed the Great Stink Act of 1858, authorising emergency funds for sewage system construction. But even then, the work proceeded slowly because many politicians still believed the crisis would resolve itself naturally. The human cost of Victorian London's sewage disaster extended far beyond the Great Stink of 1858. Conservative estimates suggest that contaminated Thames water killed over 30,000 people between 1850 and 1860. But the true number was probably much higher, because many deaths from cholera, typhoid, and dysentery were attributed to other causes by doctors who refused to accept the connection between filthy water and disease. Children were the most vulnerable victims. In the poorest neighbourhoods along the Thames, child mortality rates during cholera outbreaks reached 70%. Entire families would be wiped out in a matter of days, not because effective treatment didn't exist, but because authorities refused to acknowledge that clean water might prevent the disease in the first place. What makes this story even more tragic is that the technology to solve London's sewage crisis had existed for decades. The ancient Romans had built sophisticated sewage systems 1,500 years earlier. Contemporary cities like Hamburg and Amsterdam had modern waste management facilities, but London, the capital of the world's most powerful empire, was drowning in its own excrement because of political inaction and medical ignorance. The Great Stink finally forced Victorian society to confront the consequences of their hygiene negligence. But the damage was already done. Millions of people had suffered, tens of thousands had died, and an entire generation had grown up thinking that toxic rivers and deadly air were just normal parts of city life. As catastrophic as the Great Stink was for London as a whole, it was nothing compared to the daily horror that awaited anyone unlucky enough to need medical treatment. The next chapter of our story takes us inside Victorian hospitals and doctors' offices, where the hygiene nightmares we've been discussing reach their absolute peak. You're about to hear about surgical procedures performed with instruments that hadn't been cleaned in months, operating theatres where the floors were thick with blood and bacteria, and medical facilities so dangerous that patients literally had a better chance of survival if they stayed home and treated themselves. What I'm about to tell you sounds like something from a horror movie, but it's absolutely true. Victorian women were literally poisoning themselves to death in the name of beauty. And the most shocking part, they knew the makeup was killing them, but they kept using it anyway because the social pressure to look fashionable was stronger than their survival instinct. Welcome to the absolutely terrifying world of Victorian cosmetics, where beauty products contained enough poison to kill a horse, and where putting on your face meant applying a deadly cocktail of lead, mercury, and arsenic directly to your skin. The stories you're about to hear will make you grateful for every single FDA regulation that exists today. Let's start with the most popular Victorian makeup product, face powder. Now, when I say face powder, you're probably thinking of something light and harmless, right? Wrong. Victorian face powder was made primarily from white lead. Yes, the same lead that we now know causes brain damage, organ failure, and death. But Victorian women didn't just dust a little bit on their cheeks. They would cake this lead-based powder so thickly on their faces that it would crack and flake off throughout the day, leaving a trail of toxic dust wherever they went. The most fashionable face powder of the era was called Venetian ceruse, and it was basically pure lead mixed with vinegar. The application process was so dangerous that wealthy women employed special powder maids whose only job was to apply this toxic mixture. These poor servants had a life expectancy of about 25 years because they were breathing in lead dust every single day. But here's the truly insane part. Being a powder maid was considered a prestigious job because it meant you worked for someone rich enough to afford the finest cosmetics. Maria Gunning, one of the most celebrated beauties of the 1760s, used Venetian ceruse religiously for over 20 years. Her diary entries, which survive to this day, document her slow deterioration in chilling detail. She wrote in 1770, "My hands shake terribly when applying my morning powder, and I find myself forgetting simple words during conversation. Dr. Matthews suggests I am suffering from nervous exhaustion, but I cannot understand why, as I live such a comfortable life." What Maria was actually suffering from was severe lead poisoning, but Victorian doctors didn't understand the connection between cosmetics and illness. By 1775, Maria could barely hold a conversation and was experiencing what we now recognize as classic symptoms of lead toxicity: memory loss, tremors, and hallucinations. She died in 1776 at the age of 27, and her autopsy revealed lead levels that were nearly 50 times higher than what would be considered safe today. But lead powder was just the beginning of the Victorian beauty horror show. Let's talk about rouge, the red makeup used to give women that healthy glow. Victorian rouge was made from cinnabar, which is essentially pure mercury sulfide. Women would rub this mercury-based paste directly onto their cheeks and lips, often multiple times per day. The mercury would be absorbed through their skin and gradually accumulate in their organs, causing what doctors called rouge sickness. The symptoms of mercury poisoning from rouge use were devastating. Women would experience severe mood swings, memory loss, and eventually complete neurological breakdown. But here's the twisted part. The early stages of mercury poisoning actually made women look more attractive. The mercury would cause their cheeks to flush naturally, and their eyes to appear brighter and more animated. So women would see these improvements and use even more rouge, accelerating their own poisoning. Lady Catherine Morrison, a prominent member of London society, documented her experience with rouge sickness in letters to her sister. In 1852, she wrote, "I have been using the new Parisian rouge daily for 6 months, and everyone comments on how radiant I appear. However, I find myself subject to the most peculiar fits of anger, and yesterday I could not recall the name of my own butler." By 1854, Lady Catherine's letters had become increasingly erratic and difficult to read. Her final letter, written in 1855, is barely legible, and contains rambling passages about imaginary visitors and conversations with people who'd been dead for years. She died 3 months later, and the post-mortem examination found mercury levels in her brain tissue that were literally off the charts. The eyebrow and eyelash treatments were somehow even more horrifying. Victorian women used a substance called kohl to darken their eyebrows and eyelashes, but this wasn't the relatively harmless kohl used in ancient Egypt. Victorian kohl was made from antimony sulfide, a highly toxic mineral that could cause severe eye infections, blindness, and death. Women would apply this toxic paste directly to their eyelids and lash lines, often developing what they called kohl eye, a condition that included swelling, discharge, and eventually permanent vision damage. The most popular eyelash enhancement was a product called Lash Lure, which promised to darken and thicken eyelashes permanently. It contained paraphenylenediamine, a chemical so toxic that it's now banned in most countries for cosmetic use. The application process involved painting this chemical directly onto the eyelashes and leaving it on for several hours. The results were often disastrous. Women would lose their eyelashes entirely, develop severe chemical burns around their eyes, or go blind. The tragedy of Ethel Davies perfectly illustrates the dangers of Victorian eye makeup. Ethel was a 19-year-old shop girl who saved up her wages for months to buy a jar of Lash Lure for a special dance. She applied it according to the instructions and went to bed, dreaming of how beautiful her eyelashes would look. She woke up the next morning completely blind. The chemical had burned through her corneas, and she never regained her sight. She spent the remaining 47 years of her life in darkness because she wanted prettier eyelashes for one evening. Hair dyes were another category of Victorian beauty products that could literally kill you. The most fashionable hair colour was achieved using a dye that contained lead acetate, known as sugar of lead, because of its sweet taste. Women would soak their hair in this lead solution for hours at a time, often weekly, to maintain their desired colour. The lead would be absorbed through their scalp and gradually accumulate in their bodies. The case of Isabella Whitmore shows just how deadly these hair treatments could be. Isabella was a wealthy merchant's wife who'd been dyeing her hair with lead-based products for over a decade. In 1868, at the age of 32, she began experiencing severe abdominal pain, memory loss, and what her family described as fits of madness. Her physician, Dr. Edmund Hartwell, documented her decline in his medical journal. Mrs. Whitmore presents with symptoms consistent with poisoning, but no source can be identified. She maintains excellent health habits and consumes only the finest foods and medicines. Dr. Hartwell never considered that Isabella's weekly hair dyeing routine was slowly killing her. She died 6 months later. and the chemical analysis of her hair revealed lead levels that were over 100 times higher than normal. Her hair was so saturated with lead that it was actually dangerous to handle. The lip cosmetics were particularly terrifying because women were literally eating the poison every time they licked their lips or drank something. Victorian lipstick and lip rouge contained a mixture of lead, mercury, and sometimes even arsenic to achieve different colours. Red lips were created using mercuric sulfide, while fashionable pink shades were achieved by mixing lead with crushed insects. One of the most popular lip products was called cherry lips, which promised to give women the perfect red pout. The main ingredient was vermilion, which is pure mercury sulfide. Women would apply this mercury-based lipstick multiple times per day, ingesting small amounts each time they ate or drank. The cumulative effect was devastating. Mercury poisoning that would cause neurological damage, kidney failure, and eventually death. The beauty industry of the time was completely unregulated, which meant that cosmetics manufacturers could put literally anything in their products. Some makeup contained arsenic, which was used to create pale, translucent skin tones that were considered fashionable. Others included belladonna extract, a deadly poison that was used to dilate pupils and create a dreamy expression. What's truly heartbreaking is that many of these toxic effects were well documented, but the information was either ignored or actively suppressed. The cosmetics industry was incredibly profitable, and manufacturers had no incentive to make their products safer. Beauty magazines of the era actually printed testimonials from women praising products that we now know were slowly killing them. The social pressure to use these dangerous cosmetics was enormous. A woman who appeared in public without makeup was considered slovenly and unfeminine. But a woman who used makeup risked serious illness or death. It was an impossible choice that millions of Victorian women faced every single day. The class divide in cosmetic poisoning was particularly cruel. Wealthy women could afford the finest cosmetics, which were often the most toxic because they contained higher concentrations of dangerous ingredients. Poor women, who couldn't afford expensive makeup, often made their own cosmetics using even more dangerous household chemicals and industrial substances. Working-class women would create rouge using brick dust mixed with animal fat, or achieve pale skin by applying flour mixed with white paint. These homemade cosmetics were often more dangerous than commercial products because they contained unpredictable mixtures of toxic substances with no quality control whatsoever. The advertising for these deadly beauty products was incredibly manipulative. Cosmetics companies would publish before and after illustrations showing dramatic improvements in women's appearance, but they never mentioned the health risks. Some advertisements actually claimed that their toxic products were beneficial for health, suggesting that lead-based face powder would purify the complexion and mercury rouge would stimulate healthy circulation. The medical community's response to cosmetic poisoning was typically Victorian. They blamed the victims. When women developed symptoms of heavy metal poisoning, doctors would often diagnose them with hysteria, nervous exhaustion, or feminine weakness. The idea that cosmetics could be dangerous was rarely considered, partly because many doctors' wives were using the same products. As devastating as the beauty industry's assault on Victorian women was, it pales in comparison to what was happening to the most vulnerable members of society, the children. Our next chapter reveals how industrial hygiene failures created a generation of young victims whose suffering was so extreme that it shocked even the callous sensibilities of the Victorian era. You'll hear about children so covered in toxic soot that their own parents couldn't recognize them. Working conditions so filthy that childhood itself became a form of slow-motion torture, and a society that valued clean chimneys more than clean children. There's a photograph from 1868 that will haunt you forever once you see it. It shows a group of children standing outside a London factory, and at first glance, you might think it's a picture of small adults covered in coal dust. But look closer, and you'll realise these are children, some as young as 6 years old, who are so completely blackened with soot and grime that you literally cannot see their skin. Their eyes peer out from faces so dark they look like living shadows. These weren't children playing in dirt. These were the victims of industrial hygiene negligence so extreme that childhood itself became a form of slow-motion torture. Welcome to the darkest chapter of our Victorian hygiene horror story, the systematic destruction of an entire generation of children through industrial filth. What you're about to hear will make you want to hug every child you know and thank every labour law that exists today. Let's start with the most infamous example of Victorian child hygiene abuse, the chimney sweeps. Now, you might have a romantic image of chimney sweeps from movies like Mary Poppins, but the reality was an absolute nightmare that would make hardened criminals weep. Victorian chimney sweeps weren't cheerful adults dancing on rooftops. They were children, typically between the ages of 5 and 10, who were literally sent up into chimneys that were still hot from recent fires. The process was as horrifying as it sounds. These children, called climbing boys, would be stripped naked and forced to crawl up narrow chimney flues that were sometimes still warm enough to burn their skin. They would scrape the soot and creosote build-up with small tools while breathing in toxic fumes that would permanently damage their lungs. The soot would embed itself so deeply in their skin that they were permanently black. It wasn't something that could be washed off with soap and water. Here's a testimony from Thomas Jenkins, a former climbing boy who survived to tell his story in 1875. I was sold to Master Griggs when I was 6 years old. Every morning, he would strip me naked and push me up chimneys that were so narrow I could barely move. The soot would get in my eyes, my mouth, my nose, everywhere. After 2 years, I looked more like a piece of coal than a human child. My own mother passed me on the street once and didn't recognize me. The health consequences for these children were catastrophic. Chimney sweeps cancer of the scrotum caused by constant exposure to soot and chemicals, was so common among former climbing boys that it was considered an occupational hazard. The average life expectancy for a chimney sweep was just 25 years, and most of them suffered from severe respiratory problems, skin diseases, and developmental disorders from malnutrition and chemical exposure. But here's what's truly heartbreaking. The families who sold their children into this nightmare often did it because they thought it was better than starvation. Master chimney sweeps would pay a few shillings for a small child, and desperate parents would convince themselves that at least their child would have food and shelter. They had no idea they were essentially selling their children into a death sentence. The working conditions in Victorian factories were somehow even worse than the chimney sweeping trade. Children as young as 5 were employed in textile mills, coal mines, and chemical factories where the air was so thick with toxic particles that visibility was measured in inches rather than feet. These children would work 14-hour shifts in conditions that would be considered unsurvivable by modern standards. Let me tell you about the match factories, which were among the most dangerous places a child could work. These factories produced the matches that lit Victorian homes, but the manufacturing process involved white phosphorus, one of the most toxic substances known to humanity. Children would spend their days dipping wooden sticks into vats of this poison, breathing in phosphorus fumes that would literally rot their bones. The condition became known as phossy jaw, a disease where the phosphorus would cause the jawbone to decay and glow green in the dark. Yes, you heard that right. These children's faces would literally glow with an eerie green light because of the poison they were forced to work with. The pain was excruciating, and the only treatment was to surgically remove the entire jaw. leaving children permanently disfigured. Sarah Chapman, who started working in a match factory at age 8, described her experience in a rare interview from 1888. The smell in the factory was so strong it would make you sick for weeks when you first started. After a year, I stopped noticing it, but I started getting terrible pains in my jaw. By the time I was 12, my jaw was glowing green in the dark. The foreman said it was normal and that I should be proud to be a glow girl. Sarah was one of the lucky ones. She survived long enough to join the famous London match girls' strike of 1888. But hundreds of other children died from phosphorus poisoning, their bodies literally rotting from the inside out while they continued working to help support their families. The textile factories presented their own unique horrors. Children worked in rooms filled with cotton fibres and chemical dyes that created a toxic fog so thick you couldn't see from one end of the room to the other. These children would develop what was called mill lung, severe respiratory damage from breathing in cotton fibres and chemical particles all day, every day. The mill children were also victims of what might be the cruelest hygiene negligence in history. Factory owners would deliberately avoid providing washing facilities because they believed that clean workers were more likely to spread disease. So these children would work 14-hour shifts covered in chemical dust and fibre particles, then sleep in cramped dormitories without ever having a chance to clean themselves. Here's a report from Dr. James Phillips Kay, who investigated working conditions in Manchester Mills in 1853. The children present a most pitiable appearance, being covered from head to foot in a thick coating of cotton fibres mixed with chemical residue. Many have developed open sores where the chemicals have eaten through their skin, but they continue working because stopping means starvation. The air in these facilities is so thick with particles that a candle flame is barely visible at arm's length. The coal mines were perhaps the most dangerous places of all for children. Trappers, children as young as 6 who operated ventilation doors in mine shafts, would spend 12 hours a day sitting alone in complete darkness, breathing air so filled with coal dust that it was like inhaling ground glass. These children would emerge from the mines completely black, not just on their clothes but their skin, their hair, their teeth, everything. The coal dust would penetrate so deeply into their bodies that it was essentially permanent. Even children who left the mines and lived for decades afterward would still cough up black phlegm and have black-stained skin. The condition was called black lung, and it was essentially a death sentence. Just a very slow one. Young William Morrison, who worked as a trapper from age 7 to 12, wrote in his memoir, "I sat in that dark tunnel for 5 years, opening and closing the door when the coal carts came through. The dust was so thick I could taste it in my food, feel it in my teeth when I tried to sleep. By the time I left the mine, I was more coal than boy. Even now, 40 years later, when I cough, it comes up black." But perhaps the most shocking aspect of Victorian child labour hygiene was how normalised it had become. Factory inspectors would visit these facilities and write reports about production efficiency and profit margins, but they would barely mention the fact that children were literally dying from preventable diseases. Society had become so accustomed to seeing black-faced, coughing children that it stopped registering as abnormal. The class divide made this situation even more heartbreaking. Wealthy Victorian children were obsessively protected from any contact with dirt or germs, while working-class children were forced to work in conditions that were essentially toxic waste dumps. Upper-class families would spend fortunes on imported soap and perfumed baths for their children, while poor children were dying from diseases that could have been prevented with basic cleanliness. The educational system was complicit in this nightmare. Schools in working-class areas would actually excuse children from classes if they had jobs in factories or mines. because everyone understood that child labour was necessary for family survival. But these same schools would punish children for appearing dirty or unkempt, creating an impossible situation where children were required to work in filthy conditions but shamed for the inevitable consequences. The long-term health effects on survivors were devastating. Children who worked in these toxic environments and somehow lived to adulthood often suffered from permanent respiratory damage, skin conditions, and developmental problems that affected them for the rest of their lives. Many were unable to have healthy children of their own because of the chemical damage to their reproductive systems. What makes this story even more tragic is that child labour protections existed in other countries. Sweden had banned children under 12 from factory work in 1846. France had implemented workplace safety standards that included basic hygiene requirements. But Britain, the world's industrial leader, lagged behind because factory owners had enormous political influence and successfully argued that child labour regulations would hurt economic competitiveness. The few reformers who tried to address child labour hygiene were often dismissed as naive idealists who didn't understand economic realities. When Lord Ashley proposed legislation requiring factories to provide washing facilities for child workers, he was ridiculed in Parliament. One member famously declared that if God had intended poor children to be clean, he would not have made them poor. The photographic evidence from this era is absolutely heartbreaking. Pictures of child workers show being so covered in industrial filth that they look more like creatures from a nightmare than human children. But what's even more disturbing is how normal these images seem to Victorian society. These photographs were often used in factory promotional materials to show how productive their operations were. The medical community's response to child industrial hygiene was typically Victorian. They blamed the victims' families rather than the working conditions. When children developed respiratory diseases, skin conditions, or chemical poisoning, doctors would often lecture their parents about proper moral education and personal responsibility, rather than addressing the toxic work environments. As horrifying as the industrial abuse of children was, it was part of a larger pattern of Victorian hygiene negligence that extended to every aspect of society, including the places where people went when they were most vulnerable, the hospitals and medical facilities. Our next section reveals how Victorian medical institutions became death traps, where patients faced odds worse than soldiers on active battlefields, and where the phrase medical care became a cruel oxymoron. If you were sick or injured in Victorian England, the absolute worst place you could go for help was a hospital. I know that sounds backwards, but it's absolutely true. Victorian hospitals were so filthy, so contaminated, and so poorly managed that they killed more patients than they saved. In fact, the statistics are so shocking that they sound like something from a war zone rather than a medical facility. At Guy's Hospital in London during the 1860s, the mortality rate for surgical patients was 90%. 90%? That means if you went in for surgery, you had only a 1 in 10 chance of walking out alive. What makes this even more horrifying is that these weren't complex heart surgeries or brain operations. We're talking about simple procedures like setting broken bones, removing infected teeth, or treating minor wounds. Things that should have been easily survivable were becoming death sentences because Victorian hospitals had turned healing into a form of Russian roulette. Let me paint you a picture of what walking into a Victorian hospital was actually like. Imagine entering a building where the floors are covered in sawdust that hasn't been changed in weeks, soaked through with blood, vomit, and other bodily fluids. The smell hits you like a physical force, a mixture of rotting flesh, infection, and human waste so overwhelming that visitors regularly fainted just from entering the building. The walls are stained with God knows what, and there are flies buzzing around wounds and surgical instruments with complete impunity. The surgical theatres were the worst of all. These weren't sterile operating rooms. They were essentially public amphitheatres where doctors would perform operations in front of audiences while wearing street clothes that hadn't been washed in months. Surgeons took pride in their blood-stained coats, considering the stains as badges of honour that showed their experience. The more disgusting your coat looked, the more skilled people assumed you were. Dr. Robert Lister, one of the few Victorian surgeons who tried to promote cleanliness, wrote in his journal in 1867, "I attended a surgery demonstration at St. Bartholomew's Hospital yesterday. The operating surgeon wore a coat so encrusted with blood and pus that it could have stood upright on its own. He used the same instruments on 3 different patients without any cleaning between procedures. The mortality rate in his ward is 95%, yet he is considered one of London's finest surgeons. The instruments themselves were never properly sterilised. Surgeons would use the same scalpel, saw, or forceps on patient after patient, maybe giving them a quick wipe with a dirty cloth between uses. Sometimes they wouldn't even bother with that much. One surgeon's journal from 1855 describes using the same amputation saw on 7 different patients in a single afternoon, with the only cleaning being to scrape off the larger chunks of bone and flesh. But here's where the story gets even more insane. Victorian surgeons actively resisted any attempts to introduce cleanliness into their practice. When Joseph Lister tried to introduce his antiseptic techniques to British hospitals, he was met with ridicule and hostility from the medical establishment. Surgeons argued that washing instruments and hands was unnecessary, time-consuming, and beneath their dignity as educated gentlemen. The Royal College of Surgeons published a statement in 1869 declaring that the obsession with cleanliness represents a dangerous deviation from established medical practice and threatens to undermine the natural healing process. They literally believed that dirt and infection were beneficial for healing, and that trying to keep wounds clean would interfere with the body's natural recovery mechanisms. The hospital wards were nightmares beyond imagination. Patients with different diseases were crammed together in the same rooms, ensuring that infections spread like wildfire. A person might come in with a broken leg and leave with cholera, typhoid, and gangrene. The beds were rarely changed, and multiple patients would often share the same bedding without any washing between occupants. Here's a horrifying account from Margaret Simpson, a nurse at London Hospital in 1863. "We admitted a young man with a simple knife wound to his hand. He was placed in a bed that had recently been occupied by a patient who died of gangrene. Within 3 days, the young man's entire arm was black with infection. Within a week, he was dead. This was not unusual. We lost more patients to hospital-acquired infections than to their original injuries. The surgical procedures themselves were performed without any understanding of germ theory or infection control. Surgeons would operate with unwashed hands, often while smoking pipes or eating meals. They would use their teeth to hold sutures, spit into wounds to clean them, and share instruments between patients without any concern for cross-contamination. The speed of Victorian surgery was legendary, but not for good reasons. Surgeons bragged about how quickly they could amputate a limb. The record was reportedly 2 minutes and 30 seconds for a complete leg amputation, but this speed came at a terrible cost. In their rush to finish before the patient died from shock or blood loss, surgeons would make careless mistakes, leave foreign objects in wounds, and create ragged cuts that were almost impossible to heal properly. One of the most famous Victorian surgeons, Dr. Robert Knox, became notorious for his incredibly fast amputations. He could remove an arm in under 2 minutes, which was considered miraculous by his contemporaries, but Knox's patient mortality rate was over 95% because his hasty techniques created massive trauma and infection. His own journal records show that he was aware of this problem, but continued his practices because speed was more valued than survival. The anesthesia situation made everything even more dangerous. Ether and chloroform were available but were often administered by untrained assistants using dirty equipment. Patients would sometimes die from contaminated anesthesia before the surgery even began. The masks and breathing apparatus were shared between patients without any cleaning, spreading respiratory infections throughout the hospital. The most heartbreaking cases were the women who died from what was called childbed fever, infections following childbirth that could have been easily prevented with basic handwashing. Maternity wards in Victorian hospitals had mortality rates that would shock even medieval physicians. At Vienna General Hospital, 1 in 5 women who gave birth died within days of delivery, almost always from infections that could have been prevented if doctors had simply washed their hands. Dr. Ignaz Semmelweis, whom we met earlier, documented case after case of preventable deaths in maternity wards. He wrote, "I have witnessed the deaths of hundreds of young mothers who came to us healthy and excited to welcome their children, only to die in agony from infections that we, their caregivers, introduced with our own unwashed hands. Yet when I suggest that hand washing might prevent these deaths, my colleagues treat me as if I am insane." The hospital morgues were so full that bodies would often be stacked like cordwood in storage rooms. The smell of decomposition would permeate entire hospital buildings, but administrators considered this normal. Autopsies were performed in the same rooms where live patients were being treated, with no barriers between the living and the dead. The nursing situation was equally horrifying. Most Victorian hospitals didn't employ trained nurses instead. They used whatever women were desperate enough to work in such conditions. These were often alcoholics, former prostitutes, or women with criminal backgrounds who had no other employment options. They had no medical training and often made patients' conditions worse through ignorance or neglect. Florence Nightingale's work during the Crimean War had shown what proper nursing could accomplish, but most British hospitals ignored her innovations. Nightingale reduced mortality rates from 42% to 2% simply by introducing basic cleanliness and hygiene practices, but Victorian hospital administrators dismissed her success as feminine sentimentality and continued with their deadly practices. The class system even extended into hospital hygiene. Wealthy patients could pay for private rooms and slightly better care, but even they faced appalling conditions. The poor were crammed into charity wards where the mortality rates were astronomical. It was common for families to prefer keeping sick relatives at home rather than sending them to hospitals, because everyone knew that hospitals were where people went to die. The medical education system was completely broken when it came to hygiene. Medical students learned surgery by watching operations in filthy amphitheatres, but they were never taught about the importance of cleanliness or infection control. Generations of doctors graduated believing that dirt and infection were natural parts of the healing process. The financial incentives were all wrong too. Hospitals were paid based on the number of procedures they performed, not on patient outcomes. So there was actually an economic incentive to perform unnecessary surgeries, even though the mortality rates were astronomical. Surgeons would operate on patients who could have been treated with simple rest and clean bandages, condemning them to almost certain death. The record-keeping was deliberately vague to hide the true scope of the disaster. Hospital administrators would list cause of death as natural causes or God's will, rather than admitting that patients died from infections acquired in the hospital. When reformers tried to gather accurate mortality statistics, they were often denied access to hospital records or given falsified data. What's truly tragic is that the knowledge to fix these problems existed. Military surgeons had developed better hygiene practices during various wars. Other countries were implementing cleaner medical practices with dramatically better outcomes. But Victorian British medicine was so resistant to change that they continued killing patients, rather than admit they might be wrong about cleanliness. The psychological trauma on medical staff was enormous, though rarely discussed. Imagine being a young doctor or nurse watching 90% of your patients die from preventable causes, day after day, year after year. Many medical professionals developed what we would now recognise as severe depression and alcoholism. But Victorian society blamed this on weak character, rather than the impossible moral burden they were carrying. As devastating as Victorian hospital hygiene was, it was just one part of a broader catastrophe that was poisoning society from the dinner table up. Our next chapter takes us into Victorian kitchens and dining rooms, where the food itself became a deadly weapon. You'll discover why Victorian bread literally glowed in the dark, how dinner parties became mass poisoning events, and why eating in the world's wealthiest empire was like playing culinary Russian roulette with your life. Imagine sitting down to what looks like a perfectly normal Victorian dinner party. Crisp white bread, colourful sweets, beautifully preserved meats, and vibrant green vegetables. Everything looks absolutely delicious. But here's the terrifying truth. That innocent-looking meal contains enough poison to kill everyone at the table. The bread is glowing with a radioactive green tint from copper sulfate. The candy is coloured with lead and arsenic. The meat is preserved with formaldehyde. And those gorgeous green vegetables? They're literally shining with toxic dye that will cause organ failure within hours. Welcome to Victorian dining, where every meal was a game of culinary Russian roulette, and where the phrase, "you are what you eat," took on a horrifyingly literal meaning. The food contamination crisis of the Victorian era was so extreme that it makes modern food safety scandals look like minor inconveniences. Let's start with something as basic as bread, the staff of life that every Victorian family ate daily. You would think bread would be relatively safe, right? Wrong. Victorian bread was routinely adulterated with substances that would make a modern food scientist have nightmares. Bakers would add alum to make bread whiter, chalk to increase volume, and copper sulfate to give it an appealing tint. The result was bread that literally glowed green in the dark and could cause severe poisoning with regular consumption. The most popular additive was something called London white, a mixture of alum, chalk, and bone ash that gave bread an attractive white colour that customers preferred. But alum is essentially a form of aluminum sulfate that causes severe gastrointestinal problems, and chalk is, well, chalk. People were literally eating rocks and toxic chemicals with every slice of bread. Here's a report from Dr. Arthur Hill Hassell, who conducted secret food analysis in London during the 1850s. Of 49 bread samples tested, 47 contained significant quantities of alum, 23 contained chalk or limestone, and 8 contained copper compounds that caused the bread to emit a faint green luminescence in darkness. One sample contained so much alum that consuming a single loaf would likely cause severe illness or death. But bread was just the beginning of the Victorian food contamination nightmare. Let's talk about milk, something that should be pure and nourishing, especially for children. Victorian milk was routinely watered down with contaminated water from the Thames, then enhanced with chalk to restore its white colour and starch to thicken it back up. Some unscrupulous milk sellers would add formaldehyde to prevent spoilage, essentially serving embalming fluid to families for breakfast. The most horrifying milk additive was something called stroke, a mixture of plaster of Paris and water that would make watered-down milk look thick and creamy again. Children who drank this contaminated milk would develop what doctors called milk sickness, severe digestive problems that often led to malnutrition and death. The infant mortality rate in areas with the most contaminated milk was over 50%. Mary Thompson, a working mother in Manchester, wrote in her diary in 1862, "Little Johnny has been poorly since we started buying from the new milkman. The milk tastes strange and has an odd texture, but it's all we can afford. Yesterday, Johnny couldn't keep anything down, and his skin has taken on a grey pallor. The doctor says it's cholera, but Johnny hasn't been near any sick people." What Johnny was actually suffering from was chronic poisoning from contaminated milk. But Victorian doctors rarely made the connection between food adulteration and illness. Mary's baby died 3 weeks later, one of thousands of children killed by something as basic as contaminated milk. The meat situation was somehow even more terrifying. Victorian butchers had developed incredibly creative ways to make rotten meat appear fresh and appetizing. They would soak spoiled beef in blood from freshly slaughtered animals to restore its red color. Pork that had turned green with decay would be treated with sulfur compounds to make it look pink and healthy again. Sausages were made from a horrifying mixture of rotten meat, sawdust, and whatever else was cheap and available. The preservation methods were the stuff of nightmares. Before refrigeration, meat had to be preserved with salt, but unscrupulous dealers would use much cheaper and more dangerous chemicals. Formaldehyde was incredibly popular because it prevented decay very effectively, but it also turned the meat into a toxic substance that could cause organ failure. Lead acetate was used because it gave meat an appealing pink color, but it caused gradual lead poisoning in everyone who ate it. Here's a shocking investigation report from the Lancet Medical Journal in 1855. We have discovered that 78% of preserved meats sold in London markets contain formaldehyde, lead compounds, or sulfur-based preservatives that are known to be toxic to human consumption. One sample of fresh beef contained enough lead acetate to cause immediate poisoning in a small child. The candy and sweets were particularly dangerous because they were specifically targeted at children, and the toxic additives used to create bright colours were incredibly appealing to young eyes. Victorian confectioners used lead chromate to create beautiful yellow candies, mercury sulfide for brilliant reds, and copper arsenite for gorgeous greens. Children were literally being poisoned by rainbow-coloured death. The case of Bradford sweet poisoning in 1858 perfectly illustrates how deadly Victorian candy could be. A confectioner named William Hardaker accidentally used arsenic instead of plaster of Paris to make peppermint humbugs. The result was candy that contained massive doses of pure arsenic. Over 200 people were poisoned, and 21 died, including many children. But here's the truly shocking part. The mistake was discovered only because Hardaker used too much arsenic. If he had used a smaller amount, people would have just gotten gradually sicker without anyone realizing the candy was the cause. Dr. Henry Letherby, who investigated the Bradford incident, wrote, "The deceased children exhibited all the classic signs of arsenic poisoning: severe vomiting, convulsions, and eventual organ failure." What is most disturbing is that this may not have been an isolated incident. We have no way of knowing how many children have been slowly poisoned by contaminated confections over the years. The alcohol situation was equally horrifying. Victorian gin was routinely adulterated with sulfuric acid to give it a stronger bite, while beer was enhanced with strychnine to make it more intoxicating. Wine cellars would add lead acetate to make cheap wine taste sweeter, causing gradual lead poisoning in anyone who drank it regularly. The most popular additive was something called extract of logwood, which was basically industrial dye that gave pale wine a rich red colour. Restaurants and public houses were essentially poisoning their customers on a daily basis. Tavern keepers would buy the cheapest, most contaminated alcohol available, then disguise its poor quality with dangerous additives. The result was that going out for a drink was literally risking your life. The tea and coffee situation was another nightmare entirely. Victorian tea dealers would mix real tea leaves with used tea leaves that had been recoloured with toxic dyes, hedge clippings treated with chemical additives, and sometimes just leaves from random trees that had been processed to look like tea. Coffee was routinely mixed with chicory, burnt beans, and sometimes ground up acorns or other nuts that had been treated with chemicals to mimic coffee's appearance and taste. The food colouring industry was completely unregulated and incredibly dangerous. Victorian food manufacturers used whatever chemicals would create appealing colours, regardless of their toxicity. Pickles were turned bright green with copper sulfate. Butter was coloured with lead chromate. Cheese was dyed with mercury compounds. Every colourful food was potentially deadly. One of the most shocking examples was the use of Scheele's green, a copper arsenite compound that created a beautiful emerald green colour. This substance was used in everything from cake decorations to artificial flowers to wallpaper. It was so toxic that people would literally die from being in rooms decorated with Scheele's green wallpaper. But food manufacturers continued using it to colour candies and desserts. The regulatory situation was non-existent. There were no food safety laws, no inspection requirements, and no penalties for selling contaminated food. Food adulteration was considered a normal business practice, and consumers had no way of knowing what they were actually eating. The only regulation came from trade guilds, but they were more concerned with protecting profits than ensuring safety. The class divide in food contamination was particularly cruel. Wealthy families could afford to buy from more reputable suppliers and had servants who could prepare food more carefully. But even the rich weren't safe. Many expensive delicacies were the most heavily adulterated because the profit margins were higher. Poor families faced impossible choices. They could spend most of their income on relatively safe food from expensive suppliers, or they could buy cheaper food that might slowly poison their families. Most chose the cheaper options because immediate starvation was a more pressing concern than gradual poisoning. The international food trade made everything worse. Imported foods were often heavily adulterated to survive long shipping times, and there was no way to verify their safety. Spices from Asia were mixed with lead-based substances to increase weight. Sugar from the Caribbean was bleached with dangerous chemicals. Even basic staples like flour were contaminated with industrial waste products. The preservation techniques were particularly horrifying. Without reliable refrigeration, food had to be treated with chemicals to prevent spoilage. But Victorian food processors used whatever chemicals were cheap and effective, regardless of their impact on human health. Formaldehyde, sulfur compounds, lead acetate, and mercury-based preservative were all common. What makes this story even more tragic is that safer alternatives existed. Traditional preservation methods like smoking, salting, and drying were well established and relatively safe. But these methods were more expensive and time-consuming than chemical treatment. So most food processors chose the cheaper, more dangerous options. The medical community's response to food poisoning was typically Victorian. They blamed everything except the food. When people developed symptoms of heavy metal poisoning or chemical toxicity, doctors would diagnose them with nervous exhaustion, moral weakness, or atmospheric contamination. The idea that food might be the problem was rarely considered. The psychological impact on families was enormous. Parents never knew if the food they were serving their children might slowly poison them. Children developed chronic illnesses that doctors couldn't explain. Entire families would suffer from mysterious ailments, that we now recognise as symptoms of food contamination. As horrifying as the food contamination crisis was, it was just one manifestation of a broader pattern that divided Victorian society along class lines. The same hygiene disasters that were poisoning the poor were creating very different but equally deadly problems for the wealthy. Coming up, we're diving into the shocking truth about how money couldn't buy safety in Victorian England, how the rich had their own unique hygiene horrors that killed them just as surely as poverty killed the poor, and why having a gold toilet was no protection against deadly diseases. Here's something that will completely shatter your assumptions about Victorian society. Lord Pemberton owned 3 mansions, employed 47 servants, had gold-plated bathroom fixtures, and could afford the finest everything money could buy. Yet he died at age 34 from the exact same sewage-related disease that killed Mary O'Brien, a homeless woman living in London's worst slum. Money, it turns out, was absolutely no protection against Victorian hygiene disasters. In fact, being wealthy often made things worse because the rich had access to more expensive ways to poison themselves. This is the story of how Victorian England created 2 completely different types of hygiene hell, one for the poor and one for the rich, but somehow managed to kill people equally efficiently regardless of their bank account. What you're about to discover will completely change how you think about wealth, privilege, and survival in the Victorian era. Let's start with the most shocking example of wealthy hygiene failure: the aristocratic bathroom. You might imagine that rich Victorians had beautiful, clean, modern bathrooms, right? Well, they did have elaborate bathrooms with gold fixtures, marble surfaces, and ornate decorations. But these luxury bathrooms were actually death traps that killed their wealthy owners with stunning regularity. The problem was that Victorian engineers had no understanding of proper sewage ventilation. Wealthy homes had complex plumbing systems that connected directly to the main sewers, but without proper traps and ventilation, these systems would back up sewer gas directly into the house. The richer you were, the more elaborate your plumbing, and the more likely you were to be poisoned by your own toilet. Windsor Castle, the royal residence, was a perfect example of how wealth could make hygiene problems worse rather than better. The castle had over 100 water closets connected to a complex sewage system that was supposed to be the height of modern luxury, but the system was so poorly designed that sewer gas would regularly back up through the pipes, filling entire wings of the castle with toxic fumes. Prince Albert himself became seriously ill from sewer gas poisoning at Windsor Castle in 1859. His personal physician, Dr. James Clark, wrote, "His Royal Highness has been suffering from severe headaches, nausea, and respiratory distress that I believe stems from the noxious vapours emanating from the castle's water closets. Ironically, the very luxury that was meant to provide comfort and convenience may be slowly poisoning the royal family." The wealthy had their own unique form of clothing contamination that was just as deadly as anything the poor experienced, but far more expensive. Rich Victorian women wore dresses that cost more than most people earned in a year, but these elaborate gowns were often dyed with the most toxic substances available. The more expensive the dress, the more likely it was to contain deadly chemicals. Emerald green was the most fashionable colour for wealthy women, and it was achieved using Shields green, the same copper arsenite compound we discussed earlier. But wealthy women's dresses contained much higher concentrations of this poison because they could afford the finest quality dyes. These women were literally wearing enough arsenic to kill several people, and the constant skin contact meant they were being slowly poisoned every time they got dressed. Lady Frances Marsham, a prominent member of London society, died in 1863 after wearing a particularly elaborate emerald green ball gown to several social events. Her autopsy revealed arsenic levels that were 200 times higher than normal. Her dress, which had cost over $500, equivalent to about $75,000 today, contained enough poison to kill dozens of people. She had literally been murdered by her own wardrobe. The wealthy also had access to more exotic and dangerous beauty treatments that the poor couldn't afford. While poor women were making rouge from brick dust, rich women were using imported cosmetics that contained even more dangerous substances. Wealthy Victorian ladies would pay enormous sums for premium beauty treatments that contained higher concentrations of lead, mercury, and arsenic than anything available to the working class. The most exclusive beauty salon in London, Madame Bouchard's establishment for ladies, offered treatments that cost more than most people's annual salaries. But these treatments were essentially slow-acting poison delivered with gold-plated applicators. Madame Bouchard's signature facial used a paste made from white lead mixed with ground pearls. The lead caused organ damage while the pearl dust caused respiratory problems. Here's a price list from Madame Bouchard's salon from 1865. Pearl and lead complexion treatment. 25. Mercury rouge application. 15. Arsenic skin whitening course. 40s. These prices were astronomical for the time, but wealthy women paid them gladly because they believed they were buying the safest, highest quality treatments available. In reality, they were paying premium prices to poison themselves more efficiently. The dietary contamination among the wealthy was particularly ironic because they could afford the finest foods, which often meant the most heavily adulterated ones. Expensive imported delicacies were routinely contaminated with dangerous preservatives and additives. The wealthy were paying premium prices for foods that were actually more dangerous than what poor people ate. Rich Victorians loved exotic imported foods that had to travel long distances, which meant they required heavy chemical treatment to survive the journey. Expensive French wines were enhanced with lead acetate to improve their taste. Premium imported cheeses were dyed with mercury compounds to maintain their colour. Luxury chocolates contained lead-based additives to create attractive colours and smooth textures. The case of Lord and Lady Worthington perfectly illustrates how wealth could amplify food poisoning rather than prevent it. In 1867, they hosted an elaborate dinner party featuring the most expensive imported delicacies money could buy. The menu included French wine treated with lead acetate, German sausages preserved with formaldehyde, and Swiss chocolates coloured with mercury compounds. 12 guests attended the dinner, and 9 of them were seriously ill within 24 hours. 3 died within a week. The investigation revealed that every single item on the menu contained dangerous levels of toxic additives, but because these were premium imported foods, they actually contained higher concentrations of poisons than cheaper local alternatives. The Worthingtons had spent more money on that one dinner than most families earned in 5 years, and they used it to accidentally poison their friends. The heating systems in wealthy homes created their own unique health hazards. Poor people might freeze in winter, but rich people were slowly being poisoned by their elaborate heating systems. Victorian mansions used complex networks of gas pipes and coal-burning systems that filled houses with carbon monoxide and other toxic fumes. The most fashionable homes had gas lighting throughout, which was considered a mark of wealth and modernity. But these gas systems leaked constantly, filling houses with coal gas that could cause headaches, nausea, and eventually death. The more elaborate your lighting system, the more likely you were to be poisoned by it. Cragside House, the first home in the world to be lit entirely by electric light, was initially considered a marvel of modern technology, but the early electrical systems were incredibly dangerous, causing fires, electrical shocks, and toxic fumes from overheating wires. The wealthy owner, Sir William Armstrong, suffered from mysterious illnesses that were later traced to electrical contamination in his revolutionary lighting system. The servants in wealthy households faced their own unique hygiene nightmares. They were constantly exposed to the toxic products their employers used, cleaning ladies' cosmetics, handling contaminated clothing, and breathing in fumes from dangerous household chemicals. But because they were considered help, their health problems were ignored or dismissed as personal failings. Sarah Mitchell, who worked as lady's maid to a wealthy family for 15 years, documented her declining health in a secret diary. "Every morning I help my lady apply her lead powder and mercury rouge. By evening, my hands are stained with chemicals and my head aches terribly. I've developed a persistent cough that the house doctor says is due to my weak constitution, but I suspect it comes from breathing the powder dust all day." Sarah died at age 28 from what her death certificate listed as consumption, but her symptoms were classic signs of heavy metal poisoning from daily exposure to her employer's cosmetics. Hundreds of servants died this way, but their deaths were never connected to the toxic products they handled because their lives were considered less important than their employer's beauty routines. The wealthy also had access to more dangerous medical treatments. While poor people might not be able to afford doctors at all, rich people could afford doctors who would prescribe increasingly exotic and dangerous treatments. Wealthy patients were given medicines containing mercury, arsenic, and lead because these were considered premium treatments that only the rich could afford. Dr. Edward Jennings, who catered to London's wealthiest families, kept detailed records of his treatments. His journal from 1868 shows that he regularly prescribed mercury pills for nervous disorders, lead-based tonics for female complaints, and arsenic treatments for skin conditions. His wealthy patients paid enormous fees for these poisonous treatments, believing they were receiving the best medical care money could buy. The mortality statistics from wealthy London neighbourhoods are shocking when you realise these people had access to every advantage Victorian society could offer. In Belgravia, one of London's most exclusive areas, the mortality rate was actually higher than in some working-class districts. The rich were killing themselves with expensive poisons just as efficiently as the poor were dying from contaminated water and food. The social pressure on wealthy families to maintain appearances made their hygiene problems worse. A poor family might admit they couldn't afford clean water, but a wealthy family could never admit that their expensive lifestyle was making them sick. So they continued using dangerous products and living in contaminated environments because admitting the problem would have been socially unacceptable. The international connections of the wealthy actually made them more vulnerable to exotic diseases and contaminants. Poor people might be exposed to local pollution, but rich people were importing contamination from around the world. Their global trade connections brought them access to new and exciting ways to poison themselves. What's particularly tragic is that some wealthy families did try to address hygiene problems, but their solutions often made things worse. They would hire expensive consultants who would install elaborate systems that created new problems while failing to solve the original ones. Money couldn't buy knowledge that didn't exist yet. The children of wealthy families faced their own unique dangers. While poor children might work in dangerous factories, rich children were exposed to toxic toys, contaminated nurseries, and dangerous educational materials. Expensive children's toys were often painted with lead-based paints that were far more toxic than anything poor children had access to. The nurseries in wealthy homes were supposed to be havens of safety and cleanliness, but they were often contaminated with the same toxic substances as the rest of the house. Expensive wallpapers contained arsenic, expensive toys contained lead, and expensive children's medicines contained mercury. Wealthy children were being poisoned by the very luxury that was supposed to protect them. The irony of Victorian class and hygiene becomes even more apparent when we look at the few individuals who actually understood what was happening and tried to warn people about it. These scientific heroes emerged from all levels of society, but they faced the same institutional resistance whether they were treating paupers or peers. Coming up, we'll meet the brilliant doctors and researchers who tried to save Victorian society from itself, and discover why their life-saving discoveries were met with ridicule, rejection, and sometimes violence from the very people they were trying to help. Sometimes the most dangerous thing you can do is be right too early. Dr. Ignaz Semmelweis discovered that hand-washing could prevent countless deaths, proved it with irrefutable statistics, and begged his colleagues to listen. Their response? They had him beaten to death in a mental asylum. Dr. John Snow mapped cholera outbreaks with scientific precision, identified contaminated water as the cause, and presented evidence that could have saved thousands of lives. The medical establishment's reaction. They banned him from medical conferences and destroyed his reputation. These weren't quack doctors or mad scientists. These were brilliant pioneers who discovered life-saving truths decades before society was ready to accept them. Meet the unsung heroes of Victorian hygiene, the scientists, doctors, and researchers who fought against impossible ignorance to save lives that didn't want to be saved. Their stories are both inspiring and heartbreaking, because they show us what could have been if pride, politics, and prejudice hadn't stood in the way of scientific truth. Let's start with the tragic tale of Ignaz Semmelweis, whose story perfectly captures the devastating cost of medical arrogance. In 1847, Semmelweis was working at Vienna General Hospital when he made a startling observation. The maternity ward run by doctors had a death rate of 18%, while the ward run by midwives had a death rate of only 2%. The difference was so dramatic that women would literally beg not to be assigned to the doctor's ward. Semmelweis spent months trying to figure out what was causing this massive difference in mortality rates. Then, in May 1847, his close friend Jakob Kolechka died after accidentally cutting himself during an autopsy. The symptoms of Kolechka's illness were identical to what Semmelweis had been seeing in the maternity ward, and suddenly everything clicked into place. The doctors were coming straight from performing autopsies on corpses to delivering babies, without washing their hands. They were literally carrying death from the morgue to the maternity ward on their unwashed fingers. Semmelweis immediately instituted a policy requiring all medical staff to wash their hands with chlorinated lime solution before treating patients. The results were immediate and miraculous. Within 2 months, the death rate in the doctor's ward dropped from 18% to 1.3%, even lower than the midwife's ward. Semmelweis had proven, beyond any doubt, that hand-washing could prevent deaths. He had discovered one of the most important medical insights in human history. His colleagues' response was swift and brutal. They were absolutely furious. How dare this young doctor suggest that gentlemen's hands could be dirty? The very idea was an insult to their honour, their education, and their social status. The senior physicians organised a campaign to destroy Semmelweis professionally and personally. Dr. Johann Klein, the director of the maternity clinic, wrote, "Dr. Semmelweis's obsession with hand-washing represents a dangerous deviation from established medical practice. His implication that educated physicians could be vectors of disease is not only scientifically unfounded but socially irresponsible. We cannot allow such dangerous ideas to contaminate medical education." Under enormous pressure, the hospital administration forced Semmelweis to abandon his hand-washing requirements. Within months, the death rate shot back up to its previous horrific levels. Women were dying again because doctors were too proud to wash their hands. Semmelweis tried desperately to spread his findings to hospitals across Europe. He wrote detailed reports, presented statistical evidence, and begged his colleagues to try his simple hand-washing protocol. But everywhere he went, he was met with ridicule and hostility. Medical conferences refused to let him speak. Medical journals declined to publish his research. His former friends and colleagues began to shun him. The psychological toll was enormous. Semmelweis became increasingly desperate and erratic as he watched preventable deaths continue, while his life-saving discovery was ignored. He would sometimes burst into operating theatres and publicly berate surgeons who weren't washing their hands, calling them murderers and criminals. In 1865, his colleagues finally found a way to silence him permanently. They tricked him into visiting a mental asylum, where he was immediately committed. The official diagnosis was mental deterioration due to excessive concern with hand-washing. 2 weeks later, Semmelweis was dead. The official cause was listed as apoplexy, but witnesses reported that he had been severely beaten by asylum guards. The man who could have saved millions of lives died at age 47, rejected by his profession and broken by their refusal to accept his discoveries. It would be another 20 years before Louis Pasteur's germ theory finally vindicated Semmelweis's work, but by then it was far too late for the thousands who had died from preventable infections. Dr. John Snow's story is equally tragic and infuriating. In 1854, Snow was investigating a cholera outbreak in London's Soho district when he made a groundbreaking discovery. By carefully mapping the deaths, he realised they were clustered around a single water pump on Broad Street. Snow became convinced that cholera was spreading through contaminated water, not through bad air as the medical establishment believed. Snow's detective work was brilliant. He interviewed families of cholera victims and traced their drinking water sources. He discovered that people who drank from the Broad Street pump were dying at far higher rates than those who used other water sources. He even found that a brewery near the pump had no cholera cases because the workers drank beer instead of water. On September 7, 1854, Snow appeared before the Board of Guardians of St. James's Parish and presented his evidence. He begged them to remove the handle from the Broad Street pump to prevent further deaths. The board was sceptical, but they eventually agreed to disable the pump. The cholera outbreak ended almost immediately. Snow had proven that contaminated water was the cause, and removing the source had stopped the epidemic. It was one of the most brilliant pieces of epidemiological detective work in history. The medical establishment's response was to ignore Snow completely. The government's official report on the cholera outbreak didn't even mention his work. The Royal College of Physicians continued to insist that cholera was caused by atmospheric contamination, and that Snow's water theory was unscientific nonsense. Dr. William Farr, the government's chief medical statistician, wrote, "Dr. Snow's theory that cholera spreads through water is not supported by established medical science. The correlation he claims to have discovered is coincidental at best, and his recommendations could actually make the epidemic worse by distracting from proper preventive measures." Snow spent the rest of his career trying to convince the medical community that waterborne diseases were real and preventable. He conducted more studies, gathered more evidence, and published more papers, but he was systematically excluded from medical conferences. His research was rejected by major journals, and his reputation was destroyed by colleagues who refused to consider that they might be wrong. Snow died in 1858, still fighting for acceptance of his discoveries. It wasn't until the 1880s that his work was finally recognized as groundbreaking. By then, contaminated water had killed hundreds of thousands of people who could have been saved if the medical establishment had been willing to listen to evidence, rather than clinging to outdated theories. Dr. Joseph Lister faced similar resistance when he tried to introduce antiseptic surgery to British hospitals. In the 1860s, Lister began using carbolic acid to sterilize surgical instruments and clean wounds. His patients' survival rates improved dramatically. Surgical mortality in his ward dropped from 45% to 15% almost immediately. Lister published his results and demonstrated his techniques to colleagues across Britain. He showed them the statistics, let them observe his surgeries, and offered to teach them his methods. The response from the surgical community was hostile rejection. The Royal College of Surgeons published a statement declaring that Professor Lister's obsession with carbolic acid represents a dangerous departure from established surgical practice. His methods are time-consuming, expensive, and based on unproven theories about invisible germs. We recommend that surgeons ignore these innovations and continue with proven traditional techniques. British surgeons were particularly resistant because Lister's methods were based on the germ theory work of Louis Pasteur, a Frenchman. The idea that British medicine might need to learn from French science was culturally unacceptable to many Victorian physicians. They would rather let patients die than admit that a foreign scientist might have discovered something important. Dr. Thomas Spencer Wells, one of London's most prominent surgeons, wrote, "I have observed Professor Lister's carbolic acid rituals and find them to be unnecessary, unmanly, and un-English. British surgeons have successfully performed operations for centuries without resorting to such continental superstitions. Speed and skill are the hallmarks of good surgery, not excessive concern with cleanliness." Lister spent decades fighting for acceptance of antiseptic surgery in Britain. Meanwhile, surgeons in Germany and other European countries were adopting his methods and saving lives. British surgical mortality rates remained astronomical, while other countries dramatically improved their outcomes by following Lister's protocols. Dr. Arthur Hill Hassall represents another type of Victorian hygiene hero, the public health investigator who exposed food contamination and adulteration. In the 1850s, Hassall conducted secret analyses of food sold in London markets and discovered that nearly everything was contaminated with dangerous additives. Hassall's investigations were meticulous and courageous. He would buy food samples from markets across London, then analyze them in his laboratory using the most advanced chemical techniques available. His findings were shocking: bread contaminated with alum and chalk, milk watered down with Thames water, candy coloured with lead and arsenic. In 1855, Hassall published his findings in a series of articles in the Lancet Medical Journal. The evidence was overwhelming and irrefutable. He had documented systematic food contamination that was poisoning the entire population of London. The response from the food industry and government was immediate and vicious. Food manufacturers accused Hassall of conducting unpatriotic attacks on British commerce. Government officials suggested that his investigations were alarmist and economically damaging. Some food sellers even threatened him with physical violence. The Baker's Company published a statement declaring that Dr. Hassall's so-called investigations are based on flawed scientific methods and represent an unjustified attack on honest tradesmen. His claims about bread adulteration are exaggerated and designed to create unnecessary public panic. But Hassall refused to back down. He continued his investigations, published more evidence, and campaigned for food safety legislation. His work eventually led to the first food adulteration laws in British history, but only after years of resistance from powerful commercial interests. Dr. Henry Whitehead provided crucial support for John Snow's cholera investigations and became another victim of medical establishment resistance. Whitehead was a local parish priest who helped Snow interview families and gather evidence about the Broad Street pump outbreak. Whitehead's community connections allowed him to gather information that Snow couldn't access as an outsider. He documented case after case of families who were drunk from the contaminated pump, and then developed cholera. His evidence strongly supported Snow's water theory. But when Whitehead tried to present this evidence to medical authorities, he was dismissed as an unqualified amateur. Doctors suggested that a priest had no business involving himself in medical matters and that his evidence was worthless because he lacked medical training. The pattern was consistent across all these heroic figures, brilliant individuals who discovered life-saving truths, only to be rejected, ridiculed, and sometimes destroyed by the very institutions that should have embraced their discoveries. The cost of this resistance was measured in hundreds of thousands of preventable deaths. What makes these stories even more tragic is that the evidence was overwhelming in each case. These weren't close calls or ambiguous findings. They were clear, dramatic improvements in outcomes that should have convinced any rational observer. But Victorian medical and scientific institutions were more concerned with protecting their authority and prestige than with saving lives. The personal cost to these pioneers was enormous. Many of them died broken, rejected, and forgotten, only to be vindicated years or decades later when society finally caught up with their discoveries. They sacrificed their careers, their reputations, and sometimes their lives in pursuit of truth that could save others. But their courage and persistence did eventually pay off, though they didn't live to see it. Their work laid the foundation for modern medical hygiene, public health, and food safety. Every time you wash your hands, drink clean water, or eat safe food, you're benefiting from the sacrifices these heroes made. While these scientific pioneers were fighting their lonely battles against institutional ignorance, Victorian women were facing their own unique set of hygiene horrors that were both gender-specific and utterly devastating. Our next chapter reveals the shocking truth about feminine hygiene in an era when being a woman meant navigating monthly health crises that were literally life-threatening, childbirth practices that killed more mothers than warfare, and feminine cleanliness myths that turned basic biological functions into matters of life and death. Being a woman in Victorian England meant living with a monthly death sentence that society refused to acknowledge or address. Every 28 days, Victorian women faced what they euphemistically called the monthly indisposition, but what was actually a hygienic nightmare so dangerous that many women died from infections that are completely preventable today. The methods they used to manage menstruation were so shocking, so unsanitary, and so deadly that they make every other hygiene horror we've discussed seem almost manageable by comparison. This is the story of Victorian feminine hygiene, a world where half the population was forced to navigate biological realities with methods that were literally killing them, where childbirth had a higher mortality rate than going to war, and where feminine cleanliness was surrounded by myths so dangerous that following them could cost you your life. Let's start with the most basic challenge: menstrual hygiene. Now, you might assume that Victorian women had some kind of period products, right? They didn't. Commercial menstrual products didn't exist. Instead, women were forced to improvise with whatever materials they could find, often using the same rags, cloths, or even moss for months at a time without any way to properly clean them. The most common solution was something called a rag system, pieces of cloth that women would pin to their undergarments and wear during menstruation. But here's the horrifying part. These rags were rarely, if ever, washed properly. Remember, Victorian women believed that washing clothes too frequently was dangerous, and this belief extended to menstrual cloths. Most women would use the same pieces of fabric for months, just letting them air dry between uses. Elizabeth Garrett Anderson, one of the first female physicians in England, wrote in her private medical journal in 1870, I have treated numerous cases of what I can only describe as menstrual sepsis, severe infections of the reproductive organs caused by prolonged use of contaminated cloth materials. Many young women are dying from preventable infections because they have no access to proper hygiene methods during their monthly courses. The infections were catastrophic. Women would develop what doctors called monthly fever, severe bacterial infections that could spread throughout the reproductive system and into the bloodstream. These infections could cause permanent infertility, chronic pain, and often death. But Victorian society was so uncomfortable discussing menstruation that many women suffered in silence, too embarrassed to seek medical help. The class divide in menstrual hygiene was particularly cruel. Wealthy women could afford better quality cloth and had servants to help with laundry, but they were still using essentially the same dangerous methods as poor women. Poor women often had to use whatever fabric they could find, old sheets, towels, or even paper when cloth wasn't available. Working-class women faced an impossible situation during menstruation. They couldn't afford to miss work, but they had no reliable way to manage their periods. Factory workers would stuff rags or even sawdust into their undergarments and hope for the best. The result was that many women worked 12-hour shifts while slowly developing serious infections from contaminated menstrual materials. Here's a diary entry from Mary Ashford, a textile worker in Manchester, dated 1862. Started my monthly course yesterday but cannot miss work as we need every penny. Use the same cloths as last month as I have no others. By evening, there was such pain I could barely stand. But Mrs. Henderson says this is normal for women and I must bear it silently. The smell is becoming quite noticeable. Mary died 3 weeks later from what her death certificate listed as female complications, but her symptoms were classic signs of septic infection from contaminated menstrual materials. She was 19 years old. The medical understanding of menstruation was not just wrong, it was actively dangerous. Victorian doctors believed that menstruation was a form of female cleansing that removed impurities from women's bodies. They thought that anything that interfered with this natural process could cause serious illness or even madness. This led to medical advice that was literally lethal. Doctors would tell women to avoid bathing during menstruation because water might interrupt the cleansing process. They recommended that women stay in bed and avoid any physical activity that might disturb the natural flow. The result was that women were trapped in contaminated bedding for days at a time, creating perfect conditions for dangerous infections. Dr. Edward Clark, a prominent Boston physician whose books were widely read in England, wrote in 1873, "The female system during menstruation is in a state of delicate purification that must not be disturbed by external interventions such as bathing or excessive movement. Women who attempt to maintain normal activities during their monthly courses risk permanent damage to their reproductive organs and mental faculties." The childbirth situation was even more horrifying. Victorian women giving birth faced mortality rates that would shock modern audiences. In some London hospitals, 1 in 4 women died during or shortly after childbirth. This wasn't because the babies were more difficult to deliver. It was because the entire process was conducted under conditions that were essentially guaranteed to cause fatal infections. Victorian delivery rooms were death traps. Doctors would attend multiple births in a row without washing their hands or changing their clothes. The same instruments would be used on patient after patient without any sterilization. Sheets and bedding were rarely changed between patients. The result was that childbirth became a form of biological warfare against new mothers. The case of the lying in hospital in London perfectly illustrates the deadly consequences of Victorian childbirth practices. In 1864, this hospital had a maternal mortality rate of 24%, meaning that nearly 1 in 4 women who gave birth there died within a few weeks of delivery. The cause was almost always childbed fever, severe infections that could have been prevented with basic hygiene. Dr. William Jenner, who investigated conditions at the hospital, wrote, "The maternity wards present conditions that can only be described as pestilential. The air is thick with putrid odors. The bedding is stained with the blood and discharge of previous patients, and the medical staff move from patient to patient without any attempt at cleanliness. It is little wonder that so many new mothers perish in what should be their hour of triumph." But even when doctors like Semmelweis proved that hand-washing could prevent childbed fever, the obstetric community refused to listen. They were too proud to admit that they were killing their patients with their own dirty hands. The resistance to basic hygiene in childbirth was so strong that it continued well into the 1880s, decades after the evidence was overwhelming. The post-birth care was equally dangerous. New mothers were told to avoid bathing for at least 6 weeks after delivery because water might interfere with the natural healing process. They were kept in the same contaminated bedding for weeks, creating perfect conditions for infections to develop and spread. Victorian beliefs about female anatomy made everything worse. Doctors believed that women's reproductive organs were inherently unclean, and that any attempt to wash them could cause serious illness. This led to medical advice that was not just wrong, but deadly. Women were told to never clean their intimate areas with water, to avoid any kind of vaginal hygiene, and to accept discharge and odors as natural and unavoidable. The feminine hygiene products that did exist were often more dangerous than helpful. Victorian women used feminine washes that contained corrosive chemicals like carbolic acid, mercury compounds, and even sulfuric acid. These products were supposed to purify and cleanse the female anatomy, but they actually caused severe chemical burns, permanent scarring, and deadly infections. One popular product called Lysol Feminine Hygiene contained such high concentrations of caustic chemicals that it could literally dissolve tissue. Yet it was marketed as safe and necessary for feminine cleanliness. Women who used these products regularly often developed severe scarring that made childbirth even more dangerous than it already was. Here's an advertisement for a Victorian feminine hygiene product from 1885. "Ladies, ensure your feminine purity with Dr. Morrison's cleansing solution, containing pure carbolic acid and mercury salts, applied weekly. This powerful formula will eliminate all feminine odors and discharge, ensuring perfect hygiene and marital satisfaction. Warning: may cause temporary burning sensation." The temporary burning sensation was actually severe chemical burns that could cause permanent damage. But Victorian women were so desperate for effective hygiene products that many continued using these dangerous solutions even when they caused obvious harm. The social pressure around feminine hygiene was enormous. Women who showed any signs of menstrual difficulties were considered unclean and could be ostracized from society. The shame surrounding normal biological functions meant that many women suffered in silence, rather than seeking help for serious medical problems. The education around feminine hygiene was non-existent or actively harmful. Mothers didn't discuss menstruation with their daughters, leaving young women completely unprepared for their first periods. Many girls thought they were dying when menstruation began because no one had explained what was happening to their bodies. Victoria Woodhull, an American women's rights activist whose writings were popular in England, wrote in 1875, "The ignorance surrounding feminine biological functions is not just embarrassing, it is literally killing women. Young girls face their first menstruation believing they are suffering from a fatal disease, while adult women endure dangerous infections because they have been taught that their natural functions are shameful and should not be discussed. The pregnancy hygiene situation was particularly tragic because it affected both mothers and babies. Pregnant women were told to avoid bathing because water might shock the developing child. They were advised to wear the same clothes throughout their pregnancy without washing them because clean clothes might confuse the baby's natural development. The result was that pregnant women spent 9 months in increasingly contaminated clothing, developing skin infections, respiratory problems, and other health issues that could affect both mother and child. The infant mortality rate was directly connected to maternal hygiene problems, but Victorian society refused to make this connection. The breastfeeding hygiene practices were equally dangerous. New mothers were told never to clean their breasts because this might contaminate the milk. They were advised to let milk dry on their skin and clothing because washing it off was considered unnatural. The result was that many babies developed serious infections from contaminated breast milk. The most heartbreaking aspect of Victorian feminine hygiene was how it affected women's life expectancy and quality of life. Women who survived childhood faced a constant series of health challenges related to poor hygiene practices. Many developed chronic infections that caused lifelong pain and disability. Others died young from preventable diseases that were directly related to inadequate feminine hygiene. The economic impact was enormous too. Women who were constantly sick from hygiene-related problems couldn't work effectively or contribute to their family's economic well-being. The lost productivity from feminine hygiene problems was a significant drain on Victorian society, but it was never acknowledged or addressed. What makes this story even more tragic is that better methods existed in other cultures and time periods. Ancient civilizations had developed effective menstrual hygiene practices. Contemporary cultures in other parts of the world had safer childbirth procedures, but Victorian society had convinced itself that their dangerous methods were the height of civilization and progress. The long-term consequences of Victorian feminine hygiene practices extended far beyond individual women's health. The trauma and health problems caused by these practices affected entire families and communities. Children whose mothers died from preventable infections faced a lifetime of disadvantage. Families who lost women to hygiene-related diseases often fell into poverty. As devastating as the feminine hygiene crisis was, it reveals something important about Victorian society's relationship with cleanliness that goes beyond gender. Their bizarre belief that humans were somehow less deserving of hygiene consideration than animals. Our next section explores one of the most shocking aspects of Victorian life: how pets, livestock, and working animals received better hygiene care than most human beings, and why Victorian society valued the cleanliness of their horses more than the health of their children. In perhaps the most shocking revelation of our entire Victorian hygiene investigation, we discover this absolutely mind-boggling fact. Lady Pemberton's prize-winning spaniel received a warm bath with imported soap every single week, while her own children went months without washing. Her stable horses were groomed daily with specialized brushes and treated with medicinal oils when they showed signs of illness, while her housemaids died from preventable diseases caused by filth and contamination. This wasn't unusual behavior. This was completely normal in Victorian society, where animals routinely received better hygiene care than human beings. Welcome to one of the most bizarre and infuriating aspects of Victorian life, a society that valued the cleanliness of their pets more than the health of their own species. What you're about to discover will fundamentally change how you think about Victorian priorities and make you question everything you thought you knew about the era's values. The evidence for this shocking disparity is overwhelming and well documented. Victorian households kept detailed records of their expenses, and these records reveal spending patterns that are almost impossible to believe. Wealthy families would spend more money on soap and grooming supplies for their dogs in a single month than they spent on basic hygiene for their servants in an entire year. Take the household accounts of Lord Ashworth from 1863. His annual expenses show $47 spent on canine hygiene and grooming supplies, while only $12 was allocated for servant health and washing materials. That's almost 4 times more money spent on dog cleanliness than on human cleanliness. And remember, those servants were handling his food, caring for his children, and managing his household. The pet grooming industry in Victorian England was incredibly sophisticated and well developed. Professional dog washers were common in wealthy neighbourhoods, offering services that most humans couldn't access. These pet groomers used specialised soaps, medicinal shampoos, and even perfumed oils to keep dogs clean and healthy. Meanwhile, human children in the same neighbourhoods were developing skin diseases from lack of basic washing. Here's an advertisement from an 1865 London newspaper. Madame Bouchard's Canine Spa. Complete grooming services for discerning pet owners. Weekly baths with imported French soap. Medicinal flea treatments. Nail trimming and dental care. Your beloved companion deserves the finest hygiene care available. Rates: 5 shillings per session. 5 shillings was more than many working families earned in a week. Yet wealthy Victorians paid this regularly for their pets' hygiene, while their own servants lived in conditions that would horrify modern animal welfare organisations. The veterinary understanding of animal hygiene was decades ahead of human medical understanding. Veterinarians knew that clean animals were healthier animals, and they actively promoted regular bathing, clean bedding, and sanitary living conditions for pets and livestock. Yet human doctors were still arguing that bathing was dangerous and that dirt was healthy. Dr. William Youatt, one of Victorian England's leading veterinarians, wrote in his 1847 handbook, "The health and vitality of domestic animals depends entirely upon maintaining strict cleanliness in their living quarters, regular bathing to prevent skin parasites, and immediate attention to any signs of infection or disease. No responsible animal owner would allow their charges to live in filthy conditions." The same Dr. Youatt regularly consulted with wealthy families about their pets' health, but these same families would ignore basic hygiene for their human dependents. The cognitive dissonance is almost impossible to understand from a modern perspective. The stable hygiene standards were particularly advanced compared to human living conditions. Victorian horse stables were required to be mucked out daily, with fresh straw provided regularly. Horses were groomed every day, their hooves were cleaned and inspected, and any signs of illness were immediately treated. Compare this to factory workers who lived in tenements where human waste accumulated for weeks, or hospital patients who lay in beds that weren't changed between different occupants. The Royal Veterinary College, founded in 1791, had already established detailed hygiene protocols for animal care that were far superior to anything available in human hospitals. Veterinary students learned about the importance of clean instruments, sterile environments, and infection prevention, knowledge that human medical students wouldn't receive for decades. Here's a passage from the Royal Veterinary College's 1850 Student Handbook. The fundamental principle of animal medicine is that cleanliness prevents disease. All instruments must be thoroughly cleaned between patients. Living quarters must be kept scrupulously clean. Any sign of infection must be immediately isolated and treated. The failure to maintain hygiene standards will result in immediate expulsion from the program. Human medical schools at the same time were teaching students that cleanliness was unnecessary and possibly harmful. The contrast couldn't be more stark. The dog showing and breeding industry reveals just how sophisticated animal hygiene had become. Victorian dog shows had strict cleanliness requirements. Animals had to be bathed, groomed, and inspected for parasites before they could compete. Judges would disqualify dogs that showed any signs of poor hygiene or health problems. Meanwhile, human children in the same society were regularly attending school covered in soot and grime. The Kennel Club, established in 1873, published detailed grooming standards that were more comprehensive than any human hygiene guidelines of the era. Their breed standards included specific requirements for coat cleanliness, dental health, and parasite prevention. Dog breeders who failed to maintain these standards would be banned from showing their animals. Prize-winning dogs lived in conditions that were cleaner and healthier than most human housing. Champion bloodlines were kept in specially designed kennels with proper ventilation, clean water sources, and regular waste removal. These same wealthy dog owners often owned tenement buildings where human families lived in conditions that would be considered animal cruelty if applied to pets. The contrast becomes even more shocking when you look at working animals. Victorian carriage horses were legally protected by animal welfare laws that required regular feeding, clean water, and adequate shelter. But there were no comparable laws protecting human workers from dangerous or unsanitary working conditions. The Prevention of Cruelty to Animals Act of 1849 made it illegal to keep animals in dirty or unhealthy conditions. Violators could be fined or imprisoned. But children working in factories, mines, and other dangerous industries had no similar legal protections. It was literally illegal to keep a horse in filthy conditions, but perfectly legal to force children to work in environments that were poisoning them. The pharmaceutical industry reveals another shocking disparity. Victorian apothecaries sold a wide range of medicines and treatments specifically designed for animals, including antiseptic washes, parasite treatments, and healing ointments. These animal medicines were often more effective and safer than anything available for human use. Dr. James Paget, a prominent Victorian physician, noted this irony in his private journal. "It is remarkable that we've developed highly effective treatments for mange in dogs, yet we remain baffled by similar skin conditions in human patients. Our understanding of animal biology has advanced far beyond our knowledge of human medicine, despite the obvious similarities between the species." The dietary hygiene for animals was also superior to human food safety. Livestock feed was carefully inspected for contamination, and animals showing signs of illness were immediately quarantined to prevent disease spread. But human food was routinely adulterated with dangerous chemicals, and sick humans were often forced to continue working in food preparation areas. Pet food manufacturers had quality control standards that were stricter than those applied to human food production. Dog biscuit companies would test their products for contamination and purity, while bread sold to humans contained toxic additives that were known to cause illness. The emotional investment in animal hygiene reveals something disturbing about Victorian priorities. Wealthy families would spend enormous amounts of time and money caring for their pets' health and cleanliness, while showing little concern for the welfare of their human employees. It was common for Victorian ladies to personally supervise their dogs' daily grooming, while ignoring the obvious health problems of their servants. The social dynamics around animal care were particularly revealing. It was considered a mark of refinement and civilization to take excellent care of your animals, but caring too much about human welfare was seen as unnecessarily sentimental. A woman who spent hours grooming her dogs was praised for her compassion, but a woman who tried to improve conditions for her servants was criticized for being impractical and interfering. The technological innovations in animal care far outpaced developments in human health care. Veterinarians were using improved surgical techniques, better anesthetics, and more effective medicines years before these innovations were applied to human patients. The resistance to medical progress was much weaker in veterinary medicine, because animal patients couldn't object to new treatments on religious or cultural grounds. The training for animal care professionals was more rigorous and scientifically based than training for human healthcare workers. Veterinary schools required extensive study of anatomy, physiology, and disease prevention. Meanwhile, human nurses received little formal training, and many doctors still believed in medical theories that had been disproven decades earlier. The record-keeping for animal health was more detailed and accurate than most human medical records. Breeders kept meticulous genealogies and health histories for their animals, tracking disease patterns across generations. This information was used to improve breeding practices and prevent hereditary health problems, but similar systematic approaches to human health were rare and often resisted by medical authorities. The economic value placed on animal health created incentives for better care that didn't exist for human welfare. A sick horse or dog represented a significant financial loss. So owners had strong motivations to maintain their animals' health, but human workers were easily replaceable. So there was less economic incentive to invest in their welfare. The international perspective makes this disparity even more shocking. Victorian Britain was exporting animal welfare expertise around the world while ignoring massive human health crises at home. British veterinarians and animal care specialists were consulted by other countries seeking to improve their livestock management. But British human hygiene practices were becoming increasingly outdated compared to developments in other nations. They had proven that cleanliness and proper care could prevent disease and suffering, but they only applied this knowledge consistently to their animals. Humans, especially poor humans, were somehow considered less deserving of basic hygiene and health care than dogs, horses, and livestock. The implications of this disparity extended far beyond individual health outcomes. It shaped social attitudes, political priorities, and economic policies in ways that perpetuated human suffering while elevating animal welfare. The same society that pioneered animal rights was systematically denying basic human rights to health and cleanliness. As shocking as this animal-human hygiene disparity was, it ultimately contributed to the mounting pressure that would finally force Victorian society to confront its hygiene crisis. The contradiction between their care for animals and neglect of humans became so obvious that even the most stubborn traditionalists began to question whether something was fundamentally wrong with their priorities. Coming up, we'll explore how this growing awareness, combined with undeniable evidence and mounting public pressure, finally began to crack the wall of hygiene denial that had dominated Victorian society for decades. Change, when it finally came to Victorian hygiene, didn't arrive gradually or gently. It exploded onto the scene with the force of a catastrophe so massive, so undeniably deadly, that even the most stubborn defenders of filth could no longer ignore reality. The cholera pandemic of 1866 killed over 14,000 people in London alone in just 4 months. But this time something was different. This time, people started connecting the dots between contamination and death in ways that couldn't be dismissed or explained away. The revolution that transformed Victorian hygiene didn't happen because of scientific breakthroughs or medical advances. It happened because death finally knocked on enough important doors that society could no longer pretend the problem didn't exist. What you're about to hear is the story of how fear, desperation, and undeniable evidence finally cracked the wall of hygiene denial that had dominated Victorian England for decades. The 1866 cholera outbreak was different from previous epidemics because it occurred at a time when communication and record-keeping had improved dramatically. Newspapers could report death tolls in real time. Photography could document the devastation, and telegraph systems could spread information across the country within hours. For the first time, the true scope of hygiene-related deaths became impossible to hide. The turning point came on August 15th, 1866, when cholera struck the East End of London with unprecedented fury. In a single day, over 200 people died in an area less than 2 miles square. But this wasn't just another outbreak in the slums. The disease began spreading rapidly into middle-class and wealthy neighbourhoods, threatening people who had previously felt safe from hygiene-related diseases. Dr. John Simon, the government's chief medical officer, wrote in his emergency report, "The current cholera outbreak has demonstrated beyond any reasonable doubt that contaminated water and poor sanitation pose a threat to all classes of society."